During a raging house fire, my own father shoved me backward into the collapsing, burning living room just so he could grab my brother's hand instead. Through the thick smoke, I watched my mother lock the front door from the outside, coldly stating they could not risk losing their son, leaving me to burn alive. They spent the next 15 years mourning my tragic death. They had absolutely no idea I escaped the flames. My name is Peyton. I am 33 years old, and tonight I walked into my own memorial gala to watch my family's empire burn to the ground. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to build your own empire after your family tried to destroy you. The grand ballroom of the Waldorf Astoria in New York City was suffocatingly opulent. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm golden glow over hundreds of wealthy guests, dressed in bespoke tuxedos and designer gowns. Huge silk banners hung from the vaulted ceilings, displaying my teenage face next to the bold, elegant letters reading Peyton Memorial Fund 15th Anniversary Gala. Wait staff in pristine white uniforms circulated with silver trays of expensive champagne, while a string quartet played a somber classical piece in the corner of the room. It was an absolute masterpiece of performative grief. My parents had turned my supposed agonizing death into a highly profitable annual networking event, claiming the funds went to burn victims, while secretly funneling the donations directly into their failing real estate business. I stepped onto the plush red carpet, leading into the main hall, wearing a razor-sharp tailored charcoal suit that commanded immediate attention. The crisp fabric and the cool air conditioning of the luxury hotel stood in sharp contrast to the blistering heat that forever scarred my memory of them. The moment my heels clicked against the marble threshold, two massive security guards stepped directly into my path. They crossed their muscular arms, attempting physical intimidation to block my entrance into the exclusive gathering. I did not break my stride or lower my gaze. I simply stared straight through them, projecting the absolute authority of a woman who managed billions of dollars for a living. I was no longer the weak, frightened girl they had discarded. Before the guards could even ask to see an invitation, a piercing shatter echoed across the grand entrance hall. My mother Brenda stood near an extravagant swan ice sculpture holding court with a group of wealthy political donors. She had been wiping a fake tear from her cheek, performing her role as the grieving mother perfectly. But when she glanced toward the entrance, her champagne flute slipped from her manicured fingers and shattered into a dozen pieces on the polished marble floor. The surrounding guests fell completely silent, turning to see what had caused the elegant hostess to lose her careful composure. Brenda's face drained of all color. Her cheeks went stark white, and her eyes widened in a mixture of absolute terror and immediate rage. The ghost of the daughter she murdered was standing right in front of her. She pointed a trembling jewel-encrusted finger directly at me. "Arrest this scammer right now!" Brenda shrieked, her voice echoing off the high ceilings and completely stopping the string quartet mid-note. "Grab her. She is a fraud. My beautiful daughter died in a horrific fire 15 years ago. How dare you hire some cheap look-alike to wear my dead child's face? You are trying to extort our memorial fund. Call the police and have this lunatic thrown in jail immediately." The sheer volume of her panic caused a ripple of shocked murmurs through the elite crowd. People stepped back, whispering behind their hands, staring at the phantom standing in the doorway. The sound of her shrill voice demanding my arrest acted as an immediate, violent trigger. The clinking of crystal glasses and the soft murmurs of the wealthy donors faded away, entirely replaced by the roaring, crackling sound of consuming flames. In a fraction of a second, the opulent ballroom vanished from my mind. I was 18 years old again, choking on thick, toxic black smoke. The intense heat of the burning drywall blistered my skin as the living room ceiling began to cave in around us. My father Richard stood near the front entryway, breathing heavily. I reached out, coughing violently, pleading for him to pull me forward toward the cool night air. Instead, he planted his hands firmly against my chest and violently shoved me backward. I stumbled over a burning wooden beam, falling hard onto the scorching floor just so he could yank my terrified brother Cameron to safety. Through the cracking glass pane of the front door, my desperate eyes met my mother's. She did not hesitate or reach for the handle. Brenda reached out and clicked the deadbolt into place, locking me inside the inferno. "We cannot risk losing our son," she stated, her voice perfectly audible over the roaring fire before turning her back and walking away without a single backward glance. I blinked and the horrific memory shattered into a million pieces. I was back in the Waldorf Astoria, standing tall, breathing clean air, and completely unharmed. I was no longer the helpless teenager begging for my family's basic affection. I was the chief executive officer of Aegis Financial, a ruthless forensic accounting and investment firm that specialized in hostile corporate takeovers. I dealt in leverage logic and hard numbers, not tears and false hopes. The security guards moved forward, reaching out to grab my arms based on my mother's frantic orders. I sidestepped the first guard with practiced precision and locked eyes with the hotel manager, who was rushing over, sweating profusely to contain the scandal. I reached into the inner pocket of my suit jacket and pulled out a solid black Centurion credit card. I held it up casually, letting the heavy metal catch the light of the crystal chandeliers above us. "I am not here for your charity money, Mother," I said, my voice projecting clearly and calmly across the dead silent room, cutting through the tension like a newly sharpened blade. "I am here because the venue manager just called me. It seems the credit card your golden boy Cameron used to pay for this fake memorial was declined for insufficient funds." Brenda's jaw dropped, her mouth hanging open in stunned silence. The murmurs in the crowd instantly shifted from confusion to scandalous delight. Wealthy society members lived for financial gossip, and the word declined was the ultimate social humiliation in their circle. "Charge the entire $100,000 venue fee to my account," I instructed the hotel manager, handing him the black card. "Go ahead and keep the open bar running for these lovely guests. It seems my brother has completely maxed out his credit lines, paying off his offshore gambling debts. And I would hate for my own memorial to end early just because my family is completely broke." Before the echo of my words could even settle over the stunned ballroom, a sharp, aggressive voice sliced through the heavy silence. "What is the meaning of this?" The crowd parted instantly. Cameron pushed his way to the front, his face flushed a dark, angry red. Right beside him, marching with the terrifying precision of a woman who was used to absolute obedience, was his wife, Jada. She wore a custom emerald silk gown that probably cost more than a luxury car, and her posture radiated pure political royalty. Jada hailed from a powerful Chicago dynasty. Her father was a prominent United States senator, and she carried that title like a loaded weapon. She stopped right next to my mother, looking me up and down with an expression of absolute disgust. Her eyes darted from my tailored suit to the hotel manager, who was still awkwardly holding a silver tray with Cameron's declined credit card. "I do not know what kind of sick extortion scam you are trying to pull." Jada snapped, her voice perfectly modulated to carry just enough venom for the surrounding donors to hear. "But my father is a Chicago senator. Half the media in New York is standing in this room right now. If you think you can just waltz in here and cause a public spectacle for a payout, you have severely miscalculated." She snapped her fingers at the two massive security guards who were still hesitating near the entrance. "Security, remove this trash before she ruins our $100,000 event." The guards took a hesitant step forward, but the hotel manager held up a shaking hand, stopping them. He knew money, and he recognized the authority radiating from my stance. I did not move a single muscle. I just smiled at Jada. It was a cold, calculating smile that made her perfectly contoured face twitch with uncertainty. Cameron stepped in front of his wife, puffing out his chest in a pathetic attempt to play the alpha male. He pointed a trembling finger directly at my face. He looked so much like our father did 15 years ago, just infinitely weaker. "You are committing identity theft," Cameron barked, his voice cracking slightly on the final word. "I do not care how much plastic surgery you have had to look like my dead sister. This is harassment. My lawyers will absolutely crush you. I will have you thrown in a federal prison by morning. Now get out of my event." I looked at my brother. I analyzed the beads of sweat forming at his hairline. I noted the slight tremor in his jaw and the frantic, desperate look in his eyes. He was drowning, and he knew it. For 15 years, he had lived a life of unchecked luxury, built entirely on the foundation of my supposed tragic death. He was the golden child, the chosen son, the one they literally pulled from the fire while leaving me to burn. And yet, looking at him now, all I saw was a weak, incompetent man who was crumbling under the weight of his own financial incompetence. "You are not going to call any lawyers, Cameron," I said, my voice dropping to a conversational volume, forcing the nosy, wealthy guests to lean in closer just to hear me. "Lawyers require retainer fees. And considering the little piece of plastic sitting on that silver tray just bounced a basic catering charge, I highly doubt you can afford to sue anyone." Jada whipped her head around to glare at the hotel manager. "What is she talking about?" "Process the card again. There must be a bank error." The manager swallowed hard, clutching the silver tray. "Ma'am, I have run it 3 times." The bank placed a hard lock on the account. They cited severe delinquency. The collective gasp from the surrounding society elites was louder than the string quartet. In this room, going bankrupt was a worse crime than murder. Jada's jaw dropped. She turned to Cameron, her eyes demanding an immediate explanation. Cameron stammered, reaching out to grab her arm. "Jada, baby, it is just a glitch. The accounts are perfectly fine. It is just a minor corporate hold." I did not let him finish his lie. I reached into my sleek leather clutch and bypassed my standard platinum cards. I pulled out a heavy, solid black anodized titanium centurion card, the ultimate symbol of limitless financial power. I held it out and the hotel manager took it with wide, reverent eyes. "Charge the entire $100,000 to my account." I instructed the manager, never breaking eye contact with my brother. "Consider it a charitable donation to the hotel staff for having to deal with this family's absolute mess." I took one step closer to Cameron, invading his personal space. I lowered my voice, but kept my articulation razor sharp. "It seems the golden child has maxed out his corporate credit lines, paying off his offshore gambling debts." Jada froze. Her entire body went completely rigid. The perfectly composed political daughter vanished, replaced by a woman realizing she was married to a financial liability. She whipped her head around to look at Cameron. "Gambling debts." Jada demanded, her voice a dangerous whisper. "What is she talking about, Cameron? You told me the missing funds from the joint account were moved to a high-yield bond." Cameron stepped back, putting his hands up in a desperate, placating gesture. "Jada, please do not listen to this crazy woman. It was just a small margin call in Macau. I can explain everything. I am fixing it." He was bleeding out in front of the entire New York social scene. Jada looked at him with an expression of pure, unadulterated revulsion. She realized instantly that the rumors she had been ignoring for months were entirely true. Her pristine public image, the political legacy her father had spent decades building, was currently tethered to a degenerate gambler who could not even afford to pay for a fake charity dinner. Before Jada could unleash the full fury of a betrayed political scion, a heavy hand clamped down onto my shoulder with bone-crushing force. Richard, my father, had materialized from the crowd. His face was a mask of contained, murderous fury. The polished real estate tycoon facade was gone, replaced by the ruthless, violent man I remembered from the night of the fire. His fingers dug into my tailored suit jacket, gripping me with the exact same strength he had used to shove me into the flames all those years ago. "We are taking this conversation somewhere else right now," Richard snarled, his hot breath hitting my ear. He did not wait for my response. He yanked my arm violently, dragging me away from the stunned crowd, the horrified donors, and the imploding marriage of his golden child. He pulled me forcefully down the opulent hallway toward a set of heavy mahogany doors leading to a private VIP room, desperate to contain the massive explosion that was actively tearing his empire apart. The heavy mahogany doors of the VIP suite slammed shut, cutting off the classical music and the shocked whispers of the gala attendees. The sudden silence in the room was deafening. Richard released my arm with a violent shove that would have sent a weaker woman stumbling to the floor. I simply adjusted the crisp cuffs of my tailored suit jacket and held my ground. The polished grieving father routine vanished instantly. The mask dropped completely, revealing the ruthless, desperate man I remembered so vividly from the night of the fire. His face turned a dangerous shade of crimson, and the veins in his neck bulged against his expensive silk collar. Brenda, Cameron, and Jada hurried into the room right behind him, locking the door to ensure the press could not witness the family implosion. Jada stood near the wall, her arms crossed defensively, still glaring at Cameron over the gambling revelation. "I do not know what gutter you crawled out of or how you managed to survive that night," Richard snarled, stepping directly into my personal space in a blatant attempt to intimidate me. "But you should have stayed dead. You think coming here and paying for a party makes you a threat to me. You think a flashy black credit card makes you untouchable. You probably found some rich old fool to fund your little revenge fantasy. You are nothing but a ghost playing a dangerous game." I looked him dead in the eye, refusing to give him the satisfaction of a flinch. "You always did have a flair for the dramatic, Dad," I replied, keeping my tone completely flat and devoid of emotion. He pointed a shaking finger inches from my face. "You listen to me very carefully," he hissed. "My real estate empire is securing a $20 million bailout from Aegis Financial tomorrow morning. The ink is dry on the term sheets. The contract is signed. By 9 o'clock tomorrow, I will have enough capital to crush you into dust. I will hire the most expensive legal team in New York to bury you in court for corporate sabotage and identity theft. I will squash you like a bug and ensure you spend the rest of your miserable life locked in a federal prison." I did not raise my voice. I did not match his frantic, panicked energy. I simply turned my back on him and walked over to the private wet bar situated in the corner of the lavish room. The VIP suite was a monument to their fake wealth, with velvet walls and gold accents everywhere. I picked up a heavy crystal tumbler and reached for a bottle of sparkling water. The sharp hiss of the carbonation and the gentle pouring of the liquid were the only sounds in the room. I took a slow, deliberate sip, letting the cool water soothe my throat. "Congratulations on the impending bailout," I said, turning back to face the four of them. I leaned casually against the marble bar counter. Securing $20 million from a firm as ruthless as Aegis Financial is quite the accomplishment, especially considering your commercial properties are currently operating at a massive loss and your residential developments are drowning in severe code violations. You must have really polished your sales pitch to get them to overlook those glaring liabilities. Richard blinked clearly, caught off guard by my intimate knowledge of his failing business portfolio. Cameron stepped forward, trying to puff out his chest and stand beside his father to present a united front. "How do you know about our property margins?" Cameron demanded, his voice wavering just enough to betray his deep-seated fear. I ignored my brother entirely, keeping my focus locked on the man who had thrown me into a burning room. I set my crystal glass down on the marble counter with a sharp, definitive click. "Before we discuss your miraculous financial rescue tomorrow morning, we need to settle a very old debt," I stated. I walked over to the large glass conference table in the center of the room. I reached into the sleek leather briefcase I had brought with me and pulled out a thick manila folder. I tossed it casually onto the glass surface. The heavy thud made Brenda jump backward, clutching her pearl necklace. "Let us talk about the $2 million life insurance payout you collected on my death, Dad," I said. Brenda let out a sharp gasp, pressing her hands to her mouth. Richard froze, his eyes darting from my face to the folder resting on the table. Jada leaned forward, her political instincts sensing blood in the water. I tapped the cover of the folder with my index finger. "I have spent a lot of time tracking financial records recently. It is fascinating how money moves when people think no one is watching. The insurance company paid out exactly $2 million for my tragic, untimely demise. A payout that was supposed to compensate for the unimaginable loss of your teenage daughter. Yet less than 30 days after you buried an empty casket, that entire $2 million was wired into a private corporate holding account." Richard stepped in front of the table, trying to block the folder from view. "That money was compensation for our grief," he spat out, though his confidence was rapidly evaporating. "We had every right to use it to secure the family legacy. You were gone. We had to protect the child we had left." "Protect the child you had left," I repeated, letting a cold smile touch my lips. "You mean the child you chose to save while you left me to burn? You did not just use that money to survive. You used it to buy Brenda a summer house in the Hamptons. You used it to buy Cameron his first sports car. You built a shiny new life on the ashes of my bedroom. I looked directly at my brother, watching the color drain completely from his face, leaving him looking like a terrified child. The exact same holding account you used to fund Cameron's first tech startup? I continued, my voice slicing through the tense air. The same startup that burned through the capital in less than 6 months before filing for bankruptcy because Cameron spent the investment money on private jets and exotic vacations instead of software development. You funded his spectacular failure with the blood money you made from my murder. Brenda lunged forward, her diamond bracelets clinking sharply against the glass conference table. The initial shock of seeing me alive had entirely evaporated, replaced by the vicious defensive rage I knew so well. She planted her perfectly manicured hands on the table and glared at me with absolute contempt. You were always a difficult, ungrateful child, Brenda spat, her voice dripping with venom. Even now you come back just to ruin your brother's night. We made an impossible choice during a tragedy. We used that insurance money to secure the family legacy. Cameron is a vice president now. He is the future of this bloodline. What are you? A bitter ghost haunting a charity dinner? You should be thanking us. Your sacrifice actually gave this family a foundation. I stared at the woman who gave birth to me. She was standing there in a $10,000 gown, actively demanding gratitude for leaving me to burn alive. I did not scream. I did not cry. I simply reached forward and flipped open the heavy manila folder resting on the glass. Let us talk about this incredible foundation you built, Mother, I said, sliding a stack of crisp bank records across the table. These are internal wire transfers from Sentinel National Bank, heavily encrypted, highly classified documents that your offshore accountants swore could never be traced. But they forgot that digital ink always leaves a trail if you know exactly where to look. I spread the papers out like a deck of cards, forcing Richard and Brenda to look at their own financial sins. 30 days after the fire, a deposit of $2 million hit a shell company registered in Delaware, I stated, tapping a specific highlighted row. 48 hours later, $1.2 million of that blood money was funneled into Cameron's tech startup, which crashed a year later because he spent the capital on bottle service and leased Ferraris. But the remaining $800,000 went straight into a personal trust under your maiden name, Brenda. Brenda swallowed hard, taking a sudden step back as she recognized the exact account numbers printed on the page. I pulled out a glossy real estate photograph and dropped it on top of the bank statements. It was a picture of a stunning beachfront property in the Hamptons. You closed on this summer house exactly 3 months after my funeral. I continued, my voice rising with calculated precision. You used the cash from my death certificate to buy imported Italian marble countertops and a heated infinity pool, while I was lying in a charity hospital burn ward, enduring excruciating skin grafts and screaming through the night. You were picking out custom silk drapes for your oceanfront master suite. You literally walked over my burning body to upgrade your summer vacation plans. Jada let out a sharp gasp, stepping away from Brenda, as if the older woman were covered in disease. Jada's eyes darted frantically between the bank statements, and Cameron, realizing the entire empire she married into was built on the charred bones of a murdered teenager. Cameron tried to speak, his voice a pathetic squeak. Peyton, it was not like that. We thought you were gone. Dad handled the accounts. I just signed the papers. Shut your mouth, Cameron, Richard barked, cutting his son off instantly. Richard straightened his posture and buttoned his suit jacket. He ran a hand over his silver hair, forcing a harsh, arrogant laugh that echoed off the velvet walls of the VIP room. The initial terror of my return had faded from his eyes, completely replaced by the smug, untouchable confidence of a man who believed the legal system belonged to him. Is this supposed to be your grandmaster stroke? Richard sneered, picking up one of the bank statements and tossing it back down with absolute disregard. You broke into a few bank servers and printed out some old routing numbers. Congratulations, Peyton. You became a glorified hacker. But you clearly did not bother to study the law while you were hiding in the shadows all these years. He leaned over the table, placing his face inches from mine. You think this paperwork scares me, Richard whispered, his breath smelling of stale cigars and expensive scotch. Even if I admit right now that I used every single penny of that insurance payout to buy the Hamptons house, it means absolutely nothing. Fraud is a white-collar crime, Peyton. The statute of limitations on insurance fraud in this state expired 5 years ago. Richard stood up tall, crossing his arms with a triumphant smirk. He looked at Jada and Cameron, signaling that he had the situation entirely under control. "You are too late, little girl," Richard announced. "The money is spent. The accounts are closed. The legal window for prosecution is permanently shut. You cannot touch me. You cannot touch Brenda. You have absolutely nothing. You came all this way just to find out the law protects the winners. Now pick up your little folder and get out of my sight before I have you arrested for corporate espionage." I did not break eye contact with my father. I let his arrogant laughter fill the room for one more brief second before I delivered the kill shot. I slowly reached up and adjusted the lapel of my suit, letting a cold, dead smile spread across my face. "You are absolutely right about the corporate law, Dad," I said softly, leaning in so close he could see the reflection of his own panic returning to my eyes. "The statute of limitations for financial fraud definitely expired. The insurance company cannot send you to prison for taking their money." I paused, watching the triumphant smirk freeze on his face. "But the crime we are discussing tonight is not insurance fraud," I continued, my voice dropping to a terrifying whisper. "Arson and attempted murder for profit has no expiration date." The word arson hit the claustrophobic VIP room like a physical shockwave. Richard took a stumbling step backward, his heavy shoulders sagging, as the terrifying reality of his vulnerability finally pierced his thick arrogance. Brenda let out a strangled whimpering sound, pressing her back firmly against the velvet wall, as if trying to merge with the fabric and disappear entirely. Cameron looked like he was going to vomit. His perfectly styled hair was now damp with sweat, and his hands shook violently at his sides. But it was Jada who broke the suffocating tension. She stepped sharply between her trembling husband and me, her emerald silk gown rustling aggressively. Her political instincts were fully triggered. To a senator's daughter, a murder scandal was not just a family tragedy, it was a radioactive threat to her entire dynasty. She had spent her whole life watching fixers and spin doctors bury inconvenient truths, and she clearly viewed me as just another piece of rogue opposition research that needed to be neutralized. She looked at me with a lethal combination of panic and aristocratic fury. "You have absolutely no proof of these insane accusations," Jada snapped, pointing a manicured finger at my chest. "You are standing in a private hotel room throwing around words like arson and murder because you are bitter and desperate. Do you have any idea who you are dealing with? My father is a United States Senator. He sits on the Judiciary Committee. His legal team will bury you under so many defamation lawsuits you will not see daylight for the next 50 years. We run Chicago. We crush people who try to extort us. You are a nobody." I did not flinch at her screeching threats. Instead, I shifted my crosshairs entirely away from my blood relatives and locked onto Jada. I did not yell. I did not match her frantic, hostile energy. I simply looked at her with a mixture of cold pity and terrifying precision. She was just another pawn in my father's endless game of leverage, and she did not even realize she was standing on the board. "Jada, you really think you married into money?" I asked, my voice smooth and perfectly calibrated. "You think you married a wealthy, successful real estate heir who was swept off his feet by your charm and political pedigree?" Jada blinked, her aggressive posture faltering just a fraction of an inch as my calm demeanor unsettled her. "Tell me something, Jada." I continued, taking a slow step toward her. "Did you ever stop to wonder why your lavish wedding was thrown together in less than 4 months? Did you ever ask yourself why Cameron pushed so hard to secure the marriage license right before his company was scheduled for its quarterly financial audit?" Cameron lunged forward, grabbing Jada's arm with desperate, clawing fingers. "Jada, do not listen to a single word she is saying," he pleaded, his voice cracking into a high-pitched whine. "She is just trying to tear us apart. She is trying to ruin our family. Dad, do something. Get her out of here." Richard was paralyzed. The arrogant tycoon who had just threatened to squash me like a bug was suddenly staring at the floor, completely unable to protect his golden boy. He knew exactly what I was about to reveal, and he knew there was absolutely nothing he could do to stop the impending wreckage. Jada yanked her arm out of Cameron's grip. Her eyes darted from her sweating husband to her silent father-in-law. The political royalty in her recognized the silence of guilty men. She turned back to me, her voice dropping to a cautious whisper. "What about the quarterly audit?" I reached into my leather briefcase one more time. The sound of the brass clasp popping open echoed like a gunshot in the silent room. I pulled out a separate, slightly thinner file folder. It bore the unmistakable red crest of a notorious offshore shadow bank, a lending institution that did not check credit scores but demanded absolute unyielding collateral. I placed the folder onto the glass table and pushed it slowly across the smooth surface until it rested directly in front of her. "He did not marry you for love, Jada," I stated, delivering the facts with brutal clarity. "He married you to gain immediate legal access to your family's blind political trust fund. The second you said 'I do,' he forged your signature on a series of heavily redacted corporate guarantee forms. He used your entire political inheritance as cross-collateral to secure a high-interest loan from a shadow bank just to cover the massive gambling deficits he was hiding from my father." Jada snatched the folder from the glass table. The heavy parchment paper crinkled under her perfect manicure as her eyes darted across the highly classified ledgers. For a woman born into a powerful African-American political dynasty in Chicago, a family that had spent 4 generations carefully cultivating an untarnished legacy of public service and relentless excellence, reputation was not just a vanity metric. It was her absolute currency. She had degrees from Yale and Harvard. She had spent her entire life navigating cutthroat political arenas with flawless grace. She had been bred to spot liars, and yet the biggest fraud of all was standing right beside her wearing a bespoke tuxedo. Her hands began to shake. It was a subtle tremor at first, then a violent vibration that rattled the pages. It was not fear taking hold of her. It was pure, glacial, unadulterated rage. She traced the ink of her own signature perfectly forged at the bottom of a collateral agreement with a notoriously violent offshore lending syndicate. I stood completely still, sipping my sparkling water as I watched the exact moment Jada's world shattered. It was a beautiful catastrophe. I had spent years analyzing investment portfolios and dismantling hostile corporations piece by piece, but absolutely nothing compared to the surgical dismantling of my own toxic bloodline. Jada lifted her gaze slowly from the damning paperwork and locked eyes with her husband. The opulent VIP room felt as though all the oxygen had been instantly vacuumed out. "Cameron, tell me this is a forgery," Jada commanded. Her voice was terrifyingly calm, devoid of any of the hysterical shrieking Brenda favored. "Tell me you did not leverage my grandfather's political trust fund to cover your casino markers." Cameron opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He looked like a deer trapped in the headlights of an oncoming freight train. He was sweating profusely, the expensive fabric of his tuxedo shirt clinging to his skin. He reached out a trembling hand, hoping to touch her shoulder to placate her the way he always did when he forgot an anniversary or missed a formal dinner. "Do not touch me," Jada snapped, her voice cracking like a whip. "Answer the question." "Jada, baby, it is a misunderstanding," Cameron pleaded, his voice elevating into a pathetic nasal whine. The charismatic heir apparent was melting into a puddle of absolute cowardice. "The market took a massive dive last quarter. We had unexpected liquidity issues across the commercial portfolio. It was just a temporary hold. I only used the trust as a brief guarantee to satisfy the margin calls. I swear to you I was going to put every single penny back before your father's accountants ran the quarterly audit next week." "You forged my name, Cameron," Jada said, stepping toward him, backing him up against the velvet wall. "You stole from a senatorial trust fund. Do you have any idea what my father will do to you when he finds out? Do you have any idea the kind of federal prison time you are looking at for defrauding a political campaign account?" Cameron practically dropped to his knees. The golden boy, the supposed future of the family empire, was reduced to a sniveling wreck in less than 5 minutes. "Please, Jada, you cannot call the senator," Cameron begged, wiping a bead of sweat from his eye. "You cannot tell your father about this. He will absolutely destroy me. He will ruin my father's company. We can fix this quietly. Just give me a chance to make the money back." The so-called united front of the family had completely shattered. The polished veneer of wealthy elites was gone, leaving only a group of desperate cornered rats turning on each other. Brenda, sensing that the marriage tethering them to Chicago's political royalty was evaporating right before her eyes, decided to intervene. It was a fatal miscalculation. Brenda stepped forward, plastering on a condescending, patronizing smile that she normally reserved for the hired help. "Jada, darling, let us not be overly dramatic," Brenda cooed, reaching out to pat Jada on the arm. "Marriage is complicated. Cameron is under a tremendous amount of corporate pressure right now, carrying the weight of his father's legacy. Men sometimes make foolish financial decisions when they are stressed. What you need to do right now is be a good, supportive wife. You need to stand by your husband. Family stands together through difficult times. We keep our business behind closed doors." Jada turned her head slowly, locking her furious gaze onto my mother. The sheer audacity of Brenda's words seemed to short-circuit Jada's elite political training. "A good, supportive wife," Jada repeated, her tone dropping to absolute zero. "To a man who forged my signature to pay off his gambling debts to a shadow bank. You want me to support a degenerate criminal to protect your fragile social standing?" Brenda bristled, her fake smile faltering entirely. "You took a vow, Jada, for better or for worse. You do not turn your back on this family." "This family is a rotting corpse," Jada fired back, unleashing a wave of fury she had clearly been holding back for years. "You people are morally and financially bankrupt. I sat through countless dinners listening to you brag about your wealth and your prestige, but you have absolutely nothing. You murdered your own teenage daughter for a beach house and a life insurance payout. And when that blood money ran dry, you thought you could use my family name and my family's money to cover your rotting empire. I am not going down with this sinking ship, Brenda. I am going to call my father, and I will make sure his legal team strips this family down to the studs. You will all be penniless and disgraced before the ink dries on your indictment papers." Jada reached into her designer clutch and pulled out her smartphone, her thumbs moving aggressively across the screen. Cameron let out a panicked sob, reaching for her, but Jada shoved him away with a look of pure disgust. The implosion was total. The walls were closing in on them, and the pristine life they had built on my ashes was burning to the ground. Suddenly, a violent crash shook the entire room. Richard slammed his heavy fist down onto the glass conference table with enough force to crack the thick crystal ashtray sitting in the center. The sharp sound echoed like a gunshot, instantly silencing Brenda's gasps and Cameron's pathetic whimpering. Richard's chest heaved as he glared at everyone in the room, his eyes wild and bloodshot with desperate arrogance. "Enough," Richard roared, his voice booming off the velvet walls. "Stop this pathetic whining right now. None of this matters." He turned his furious gaze back to me, pointing a rigid finger directly at my chest. "Tomorrow morning at exactly 9 o'clock. Aegis Financial is wiring $20 million directly into my corporate accounts." Richard declared, his voice dripping with absolute malice. "The deal is completely finalized. I will use that money to pay back Jada's senatorial trust fund before the audit. And then I will take the rest of that capital and I will hire the most ruthless, merciless fixers in the entire country to deal with you, Peyton. You will wish you had died in that fire." The echo of Richard's fist slamming against the glass table faded, leaving a heavy, suffocating silence in the VIP room. For a brief, fleeting moment, my father actually looked like the untouchable titan he had spent his entire life pretending to be. His chest was puffed out, his silver hair catching the ambient light, and his jaw was set with absolute supreme confidence. He truly believed he had won. He believed that $20 million from Aegis Financial was an impenetrable shield that would protect him from his crimes, from his debts, and from the ghost of the daughter he had tried to burn alive. Cameron let out a massive, ragged breath of relief. The sheer terror that had been paralyzing him just seconds ago melted away, replaced by a pathetic, sycophantic grin. He looked at his father with pure hero worship, completely forgetting that Jada was still staring at him with absolute disgust. Brenda smoothed the front of her expensive gown, her posture returning to its usual arrogant rigidity. She crossed her arms and shot me a look of pure, triumphant malice. They all thought the game was over. They thought money had saved them once again. I did not say a word. I did not blink. I simply let the silence stretch out, allowing Richard to bask in his false victory for a few more seconds. Let him feel the absolute peak of his power. It would make the fall so much more devastating. Slowly and with deliberate precision, I reached into the interior pocket of my blazer. Richard flinched slightly, his eyes darting to my hand, perhaps fearing I was reaching for a weapon. But I only pulled out my smartphone. The screen cast a pale blue glow across my face as I tapped a few icons. I turned my back to my family and walked toward the massive 100-inch smart TV mounted on the far wall of the private dining room. "What are you doing?" Richard barked, his confidence wavering just a fraction at my lack of intimidation. "Are you calling the police?" "Go ahead. Call them. My lawyers will have me out on bail before you even finish giving your statement." I ignored him. I swiped my finger across my screen, activating the casting feature. A soft chime echoed through the room, and the massive television screen flashed from black to a crystal-clear, high-definition video feed. The room collectively gasped. On the screen, sitting behind a massive, polished mahogany desk in a brightly lit corporate office, was a man in his late 50s. He wore a sharp charcoal suit, and his silver hair was impeccably styled. Behind him, etched into frosted glass, was the imposing logo of Aegis Financial. Richard took a sudden, sharp step backward. All the color instantly drained from his face, leaving him looking like a sick old man. He recognized the face on the screen immediately. It was Marcus Vance, the notoriously ruthless chief legal counsel for Aegis Financial, the man who had been personally auditing Richard's failing company for the past 6 months, the man holding the keys to the $20 million lifeline Richard was depending on. "Mr. Vance." Richard stammered, his voice suddenly devoid of all its previous bravado. "Marcus, what is going on here? Why are you on a video call?" Marcus Vance did not even acknowledge my father's existence. He did not look at Richard, Brenda, or Cameron. His eyes were locked firmly on the camera lens, addressing me with a level of absolute deference and respect that made my father's knees visibly buckle. "Good evening, Marcus," said his deep voice filling the VIP room. "I have been monitoring the feed as requested. We are standing by for your directives." I turned slightly so I could see the screen and the terrified faces of my family at the same time. Jada had taken a step back, her hands covering her mouth as she realized the true scale of what was happening. She was watching a complete paradigm shift. The power dynamic in the room had just flipped with such violent force that it was practically vibrating the walls. "Marcus," I said, my voice echoing with cold, clinical authority, "cancel the $20 million disbursement for Richard's real estate group immediately. I want the transfer killed at the routing level." "Understood," Marcus replied without a single second of hesitation, typing rapidly on his keyboard. "The disbursement is officially cancelled. The funds have been pulled back into our primary holding accounts." "No!" Richard screamed, lunging toward the television screen as if he could physically reach through the glass and stop the keystrokes. "Marcus, you cannot do this. We have a signed agreement. We have a legally binding contract. That money is the only thing keeping my company out of bankruptcy. You promised me that capital." Marcus ignored the frantic shouting. He kept his eyes perfectly trained on me, awaiting his next instruction. Furthermore, I continued my tone devoid of any emotion. "Initiate immediate default proceedings on all their collateral. Call in every single loan. Freeze their operating accounts, block their lines of credit, and trigger the liquidation clauses on their commercial properties. I want them locked out of their own buildings by sunrise." "Consider it done," Marcus stated smoothly. "The foreclosure notices will be filed with the county clerk electronically tonight. Their access to all Aegis-backed capital is permanently severed. Have a good evening." The screen clicked black. The silence that followed was absolute. It was the sound of a dynasty evaporating into dust. Cameron collapsed into one of the velvet chairs, putting his head between his knees and sobbing openly. His life of leased Ferraris and VIP bottle service was gone forever. Brenda was clutching the edge of the table, taking short, shallow breaths, her eyes wide with unadulterated shock, as she realized the Hamptons house and the diamond bracelets were about to be seized by federal marshals. Richard looked like a hollow shell. His jaw hung open and his hands trembled violently. The titan of Chicago real estate was dead. He stared at the blank television screen and then slowly turned his head to look at me. His brain was desperately trying to process the impossible reality unfolding in front of him. He could not understand how the scarred, discarded daughter he had left for dead could possibly command the most powerful financial institution in the country. "Who are you two?" "Aegis." Richard choked out his voice, nothing more than a ragged, terrified whisper. I stood up perfectly straight. I looked at the broken man who had destroyed my life, and I slowly, deliberately buttoned the center button of my tailored suit jacket. I met his horrified gaze with eyes as cold and dead as the ashes of my former life. "I do not work for Aegis, Dad," I said, my voice slicing through the room with devastating finality. "I founded it. I am the CEO. You have been begging your dead daughter for money for 6 months." The silence that followed my declaration was absolute and heavy enough to crack the concrete foundation of the building. I watched as the full, crushing weight of my words finally penetrated Richard's thick, arrogant skull. The untouchable tycoon did not just falter, he completely collapsed inward. His knees actually buckled under the weight of his own hubris, forcing him to grip the sharp edge of the shattered glass table just to keep himself upright. His mouth opened and closed in a silent, rhythmic gasp, like a fish suffocating on dry land. The realization was a physical trauma to him. For 6 grueling months, he had poured his immense pride into groveling emails and desperate financial pitches, begging the faceless executives at Aegis Financial for a lifeline. He had exposed every single vulnerability, every rotting beam in his commercial empire, and laid it completely bare for my inspection. I had read every pathetic plea. I had authorized every invasive audit that slowly tightened the financial noose around his neck. And now the reality of his situation crystallized in his widened, bloodshot eyes. He was not just losing a lucrative real estate deal, he was officially and irrevocably bankrupt. The banks would swarm his properties by dawn. His reputation, his legacy, his very identity had just been erased by the daughter he murdered. The stench of Richard's ruined empire hung thick in the air, but Brenda possessed a parasitic survival instinct that bordered on pure sociopathy. She watched her powerful husband crumble and realized instantly that the ship had completely sunk. The glorious dynasty she had married into was dead. But sitting right in front of her was a brand new apex predator wrapped in a tailored suit and commanding billions in institutional capital. I watched the exact second her brain rebooted. The vicious, sneering woman who had just demanded I thank her for stealing my life insurance payout vanished without a trace. In her place, a grotesque imitation of a grieving, loving mother emerged. Her face crumpled into a mask of theatrical agony. She forced heavy tears into her eyes, letting them spill over her perfectly contoured cheeks and ruin her expensive mascara. She took a slow step toward me, her hands trembling as she reached out. "Peyton, my baby," she wailed, her voice pitching into a hysterical, desperate register that echoed off the velvet walls. "You are alive. I missed you so much. We thought we had lost you forever. I prayed every single day that this was all just a nightmare." She took another step, closing the distance between us, her arms wide open, ready to pull me into a maternal embrace, as if the last decade of my agonizing recovery had simply been a slight familial misunderstanding. She looked at me with wide, pleading eyes, completely ignoring the fact that Jada was staring at her in absolute horror. "Please, Peyton," she sobbed, her voice cracking with manufactured grief. "You have to save your brother. Look at what this stress is doing to Cameron. Look at what it is doing to our family. We can fix this together. We are family. We are blood." As her manicured hands reached for my shoulders, the cloying scent of her expensive jasmine perfume hit my face. It was the exact same perfume she wore the night she stood in the hallway and listened to me burn. A violent, visceral surge of adrenaline spiked through my veins, instantly replacing my cold calculation with blinding hot rage. I did not step back. I did not flinch. I lunged forward and violently shoved Brenda away from me. The sheer force of my push sent her stumbling backward in her stiletto heels until she crashed hard against the wall. Her designer clutch fell to the floor, spilling gold lipsticks and platinum credit cards across the carpet. "Do not touch me," I snarled, my voice vibrating with a decade of suppressed agony. The room temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees as I stepped toward her, pinning her against the wall with my gaze. Brenda gasped, clutching her chest in mock terror, but I did not let her look away. "Blood meant absolutely nothing when you locked that heavy oak door," while I screamed for help, I told her, my voice dropping to a lethal whisper. "You stood on the other side of that wood and listened to the flames blister my skin. You listened to my lungs fill with black smoke. You left me to be cremated alive so you could upgrade your zip code and buy imported marble for your summer house. Do not dare stand here and pretend to be my mother. You do not love me, Brenda. You love my portfolio. You love the power I just demonstrated, and you are terrified because you know I am going to use every single ounce of it to grind you into dust." Brenda let out a pathetic whimpering sound, sliding down the wall slightly as the undeniable truth of my hatred washed over her. She had no leverage. She had no charm left to weaponize. Her tears dried up instantly, replaced by the stark realization that I was immune to her manipulation. From the corner of the room, Cameron suddenly scrambled to his feet. His face was a blotchy mess of tears and sweat, but a desperate manic energy had suddenly seized his trembling body. He could not accept that his life of privilege was over. He pointed a shaking finger at me, his voice cracking with hysterical defiance. "You cannot ruin us completely, Peyton!" he yelled, wiping a thick layer of sweat from his forehead. "You can take the properties, but you cannot take everything. Dad has fixers. He has contingency plans. He still has millions hidden away in private accounts that your little financial firm can never reach. We will bounce back from this. We will hire a massive legal team, and we will bury you in litigation until you are the one begging us for a settlement." I turned slowly away from the trembling shell of my mother and looked directly at my brother. A slow, genuinely amused smile spread across my face. I let out a sharp, chilling laugh that echoed off the high ceilings, silencing his pathetic outburst. "Oh, Cameron," I said softly, tilting my head as I watched the last shred of false hope flickering in his panicked eyes. "Did Dad not tell you about the Cayman Islands?" The silence in the room stretched so tight, it felt like a piano wire ready to snap. Cameron slowly turned his head away from me and looked at his father. The desperate manic energy that had just animated him drained away instantly, leaving behind a hollow, sickening dread. Richard did not look at his son. He was staring a hole through the carpet, his chest rising and falling in sharp, erratic jerks. He looked like a cornered animal realizing the trap had just sprung shut. "What Cayman Islands?" Cameron asked, his voice dropping to a hoarse whisper. "Dad, what is she talking about?" I stepped away from the wall, smoothing the lapels of my jacket. I did not need to raise my voice. The absolute silence in the VIP room made every syllable I spoke ring with devastating clarity. "Your father has always been a survivor, Cameron," I stated, pacing slowly around the shattered glass of the conference table. "He built his empire on the charred remains of my life, so it should not surprise you that he planned to build his retirement on the ruins of yours. 6 months ago, when your commercial real estate division started hemorrhaging money, you went to him for help. You handed over the ledgers. You let him take the wheel. You thought the great Richard Thorne was stepping in to rescue his golden boy." Cameron swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. "He told me to just sign the authorization forms. He said he was restructuring the debt." "And you signed them," I replied, a cold smile touching the corners of my mouth. "You signed every single one of them without reading the fine print. You gave him unchecked authorization to liquidate the remaining assets. But he did not restructure your debt, Cameron. He accelerated the bleeding. He took the last $30 million of your company's operating capital and funneled it through a labyrinth of shell corporations in Delaware and Cyprus. Richard finally lunged forward, his face contorted in purple rage. "Shut your mouth, you vindictive little," he roared, raising a fist as if he meant to strike me. I did not even flinch. I just stared at him, daring him to close the distance. He froze his fist, hovering in the air, paralyzed by the realization that striking the CEO of the firm holding his execution orders would only expedite his ruin. He slowly lowered his hand, his breathing ragged. "Tell him the rest, Dad." I challenged, my eyes locking onto his. "Tell your son where that 30 million went. Tell him how it ended up in an impenetrable offshore account in Grand Cayman, under a proxy name that only you control." Cameron took a staggering step toward his father. The reality of the betrayal was tearing through his mind. The audits, the missing funds, the shadow bank loans. It was all falling perfectly into place, forming a picture of absolute horror. "You stole it," Cameron whispered, his eyes wide with disbelief. "You stripped my company bare and hid the cash offshore. But the federal investigators, they are looking at my signature on the guarantee forms. They are looking at me." "That was the entire point of the exercise," I interjected, twisting the knife deeper. "He knew the feds were circling. He knew the fraud was too massive to hide anymore. So he set you up to be the sole fall guy. When the indictments drop next week, your name is on every single fraudulent wire transfer. You are looking at 20 years in federal prison for corporate embezzlement. And while you are wearing an orange jumpsuit and sleeping on a concrete slab, your father was scheduled to be sitting on a private beach in the Caribbean, immune from extradition. He was going to let you take the fall so he could escape." The air rushed out of Cameron's lungs in a violent sob. He looked at the man he had idolized his entire life, the man he had lied for and covered up crimes for. "You were going to let me go to prison," Cameron screamed, his voice cracking into a primal shriek. "I am your son. I am your blood. You threw Peyton into a fire, and now you are throwing me into a cage." Richard finally snapped. The polished aristocratic mask dissolved completely, revealing the ruthless, cowardly monster beneath. "You are a weak, pathetic idiot," Richard spat, stepping toward Cameron with his chest puffed out. "You ruined the business. You squandered the Thorne legacy on expensive cars and stupid investments. I built this empire from nothing. I secured our future. I was not going to let your staggering incompetence drag me down with you. You deserved to take the fall. You are a failure." Something inside Cameron finally broke. Decades of pressure, the endless, desperate need for approval, and the ultimate realization of this profound betrayal collided in his mind. With a guttural roar, Cameron lunged at his father. He tackled Richard around the waist, sending both men crashing hard into the velvet wall. Expensive artwork rattled and fell to the floor as they tangled together in a chaotic, violent brawl. It was not a calculated fight. It was feral and ugly. Cameron drove his fist into Richard's jaw with a sickening crunch, tearing the collar of his father's bespoke shirt. Richard clawed frantically at Cameron's face, gasping for air as they rolled across the expensive carpet. Glass crunched beneath their heavy shoes as they smashed into the remains of the conference table. Brenda let out a piercing, hysterical scream, pressing her hands against the sides of her head. "Stop it!" she shrieked, paralyzed by the horrific violence erupting in front of her. "Stop it, you are destroying each other." Neither man listened. They were entirely consumed by their own destruction, trading desperate blows and tearing each other apart like wild animals trapped in a burning cage. They were drowning in the toxic empire they had built, and they were determined to take each other down to the absolute bottom. I stood motionless, watching the carnage with cold, clinical detachment. This was exactly what they deserved. The Thorne family was finally burning, and I was the one holding the match. As the two men thrashed and bled on the floor, my peripheral vision caught a subtle movement near the edge of the room. While Brenda was screaming and the men were destroying themselves, Jada had silently detached herself from the chaos. The polished political strategist was executing a tactical retreat. She was slipping quietly into the shadows, backing slowly toward the heavy mahogany door. Her eyes were fixed on her smartphone screen, her manicured thumb hovering over the dial pad. She was preparing to call her father's fixers to deploy the spin doctors and sever her legal ties to the Thorne family before the federal indictments went public. She was cutting her losses, ready to leave her husband bleeding on the floor to save her own political skin. I turned my head slowly, tracking her movement. Just as her hand reached out to grasp the brass handle of the door, I stepped into her line of sight. I locked eyes with her, freezing her in her tracks. A cold, dead smile touched my lips. Going somewhere, Jada. Jada froze, her manicured hand hovering over the heavy brass doorknob. The color drained from her perfectly contoured face, but her elite political training kicked in immediately. She squared her shoulders, lifting her chin in a desperate attempt to summon the aristocratic authority she had wielded for her entire life. She was a master of high-stakes damage control raised in the notoriously ruthless arenas of Chicago politics. "I am calling my father's team," Jada stated, her voice a sharp, icy whip. "I am calling the fixers. You might have destroyed this pathetic excuse for a family paten, but you are not dragging my name into this gutter. My father's political empire will not be tainted by Cameron's colossal stupidity. By tomorrow morning, my legal separation will be filed and every trace of my association with the Thorne family will be scrubbed from the public record. You can keep the ashes." I let out a slow, dark chuckle. It was a sound entirely devoid of humor or warmth. I slowly shook my head, watching her desperate illusion of control begin to fracture. "Too late, Jada." I said, my words dropping like anvils onto the velvet carpet. "Your father's fixers cannot scrub away a federal paper trail that is already sitting in the inbox of every major investigative journalist in the city." Jada's confident posture snapped. Her eyes darted around the room as if physically searching for an escape hatch. "What are you talking about? Did you really think I would walk into this room without a failsafe?" I asked, stepping closer to her. The exact moment I ordered Marcus to cancel the Aegis bailout, a synchronized automated email was triggered. A highly encrypted file containing every single fraudulent routing number, every offshore shell company, and every forged signature on your joint trust fund documents was sent directly to the senior editorial desk at the Chicago Tribune. Jada gasped, a sharp intake of breath that sounded like a physical wound. She pressed her back against the heavy mahogany door, her eyes wide with mounting terror. "No," she whispered frantically, shaking her head. "No, you could not have. My father is in the middle of a highly contested re-election campaign. A federal embezzlement scandal of this magnitude will destroy him. It will destroy my entire family." "It already has," I corrected her coldly. "The journalists are likely reading through the ledgers right now. By tomorrow morning, the front-page headline will not be about Richard Thorne's corporate bankruptcy. It will be about how the prominent politically connected Jada Thorne was listed as a primary co-signer on a $30 million offshore embezzlement scheme. They will paint you as the criminal mastermind Jada, the brilliant political daughter who helped her idiot husband hide stolen capital in the Cayman Islands." "I did not sign those papers," Jada shrieked, losing all semblance of her polished demeanor. "I never saw those offshore accounts. Cameron forged my signatures. He swore to me he was just moving domestic assets to protect our local portfolio. I am innocent." "I know you are innocent," I replied smoothly. "And I know Cameron forged your signature because my cybersecurity team is the one who tracked the IP addresses directly to his private laptop. But the FBI does not know that. The media does not know that. And frankly, public opinion does not care about the truth. The public just wants a wealthy, beautiful villain to crucify." Cameron, who was still bleeding on the floor from his vicious brawl with Richard, weakly raised his head. "Jada, please!" he groaned, spitting blood onto the carpet. "Do not listen to her. We can call your dad. We can pool our resources and fight this together." Jada looked down at her husband with an expression of pure, unadulterated disgust. He was no longer the golden heir she had married. He was a massive liability. He was a toxic, sinking anchor tied directly to her ankle. I stepped directly into Jada's line of sight, forcing her to look at me. I was the only person in the room holding a life raft. "You have one option, Jada," I said, my voice dropping to a low, commanding octave. "One single solitary path out of a federal prison cell. I control the largest financial public relations firm on the East Coast. If I give the word, my team can shape the media narrative by dawn. but you have to give me exactly what I want." "What do you want?" she asked, her voice trembling, her political instincts recognizing a brutal negotiation when she saw one. "Turn state's witness," I demanded. "You walk out of this room, you pick up your phone, and you bypass your father's fixers completely. You call the regional director of the FBI. You hand them Cameron on a silver platter. You testify against your husband in open federal court regarding the forged signatures on your trust documents and his illegal offshore accounts." Cameron let out a pathetic wail, clutching his bruised ribs. "Jada, no, you cannot testify against me. Spousal privilege. You do not have to say a single word. Spousal privilege does not cover joint financial fraud when you are implicated as a co-conspirator, Cameron." I snapped without even looking at him. I kept my eyes locked firmly on Jada. "You testify against him, Jada, and I will make sure the media paints you as the tragic victim. The deceived, trusting wife whose manipulative husband destroyed her life and stole her identity. You will not just survive this scandal. You will become a sympathetic public figure. Your father's campaign will actually benefit from the massive outpouring of public support." I leaned in inches from her face. "But if you try to protect him, if you try to call your father's fixers and fight me, I will release the secondary files. The ones that show exactly how much of Cameron's stolen money funded your luxury charity galas last year. It is your choice, Jada. A victim or an accomplice. Choose right now." The silence in the room was absolute. The only sound was Richard's ragged breathing from the corner and Cameron's pathetic sobbing on the floor. Jada stood perfectly still, her mind calculating the odds, running the political algorithms she had been taught since birth. She looked at the blood on Cameron's face, the ruined, expensive suit, the total destruction of his power. She looked back at me. The fear in her eyes was completely gone, replaced by cold, hard survival. She had always been a political creature first and a wife second. Jada nodded once, a sharp, definitive movement. She did not say a single word to her husband. She did not offer him a glance of pity or a tear of regret. She simply adjusted the strap of her designer purse, pushed the heavy brass handle down, and pulled the mahogany door open. She walked out of the VIP room, her heels clicking against the marble floor of the hallway, dialing the federal authorities before the door even clicked shut behind her. As the heavy oak door clicked shut, the finality of the sound reverberated through the ruined dining space. The click was a death knell. Brenda, who had been slumped against the expensive wallpaper, let out a high, thin keen of pure despair. She buried her face in her hands, finally understanding that her proximity to wealth and power had been completely severed. There were no more galas, no more charity boards, no more sneering at the less fortunate. She was now the mother of a federally indicted felon and the wife of a bankrupt fraudster. Richard remained on the floor, his tailored suit ripped and stained with his own blood. The former titan of industry did not even try to stand. He simply stared blankly at the ceiling, his chest heaving, his eyes glassy and vacant. The Cayman Island funds, the escape plan, the brilliant exit strategy he had meticulously crafted for himself. It was all gone. He had sacrificed his own son for a parachute that I had just set completely on fire. I walked slowly toward the center of the room, my heels crunching over the shattered remnants of the glass table. I stopped right in front of Cameron. He was curled into a tight fetal position, clutching his bruised ribs. He looked up at me through tear-soaked, swollen eyes. The arrogant sneer that had defined his entire existence had been utterly obliterated. He reached out a trembling, blood-stained hand toward my perfectly polished shoes. A silent, pathetic plea for a mercy he had never once shown me. I did not step back. I just looked down at him, feeling the absolute purity of the justice I had delivered. He was experiencing the exact same paralyzing isolation I had felt 10 years ago when the flames were creeping toward my bedroom door. Cameron Thorne, the golden boy, the untouchable heir, was officially and completely alone. The heavy mahogany door clicked shut, severing Jada from the room and sealing the rest of us inside. Cameron remained curled on the carpet, a broken, sobbing mess, officially abandoned by the only ally he had left. But the silence that followed Jada's departure did not last. A sudden, violent scraping sound shattered the quiet as Richard dragged himself up from the floor. His bespoke Italian suit was ruin-torn at the shoulder and stained with his own blood from the brawl with his son. He spat a mouthful of crimson onto the pristine carpet and wiped his mouth with the back of his trembling hand. But as he stood there, surrounded by the physical and financial wreckage of his empire, the glassy, vacant look in his eyes vanished. The paralyzing shock of his bankruptcy evaporated, replaced instantly by a dark, homicidal desperation. He was a cornered animal realizing all his exit routes had been boarded up. He had no money, he had no power, he had no future, but he still had his massive, imposing physical size, and he still had his capacity for extreme violence. Richard ignored his weeping son. He ignored his hysterical wife cowering against the wall. He marched directly to the heavy brass handle of the VIP dining room door and turned the deadbolt. The loud metallic slide of the lock echoed through the room like a gunshot. He turned around, his chest heaving, his jaw set in a rictus of pure unadulterated malice. He locked us in. Slowly, deliberately, Richard began to walk toward me. His heavy leather shoes crunched over the shattered glass of the conference table. His breathing was ragged, his eyes wide and bloodshot. He towered over me, using every inch of his height to project maximum physical intimidation. The scent of copper sweat and expensive scotch radiated off him. "Open your phone," Richard snarled, his voice vibrating with a lethal, terrifying edge. "You are going to call Marcus Vance back right now. You are going to authorize the release of that $20 million, and you are going to wire it directly into a decentralized offshore account that I provide." I did not move a single muscle. I kept my posture perfectly straight, my hands resting loosely at my sides. I looked up into his bloody, desperate face with absolute zero emotion. And if I refuse, I asked, my voice barely a whisper yet ringing clearly through the room. Richard stepped so close that I could feel the heat radiating from his skin. He balled his massive hands into tight fists, his knuckles turning white. "If you refuse, I will kill you right here." He spat, the veins in his neck bulging against his torn collar. "I will snap your neck with my bare hands. I should have made sure you were dead in that ash heap 15 years ago. I should have poured the gasoline directly onto your bed while you slept. I will not make the mistake of leaving you breathing twice." Brenda let out a muffled, horrified gasp from the corner, pressing her hands over her mouth. Even she, with all her staggering cruelty, seemed paralyzed by the sheer, naked evil radiating from her husband. But I did not flinch. I had spent a decade anticipating this exact moment. I had rebuilt my body, my mind, and my entire existence around the knowledge that Richard Thorne was a monster. His physical proximity meant absolutely nothing to me. A man who relies on brute force is a man who has already lost the intellectual war. "You are a coward, Richard," I stated calmly. "You always have been. You hire other people to do your dirty work because you lack the actual courage to get your own hands dirty." I slowly reached into the pocket of my blazer. Richard tensed his eyes, tracking my hand, clearly expecting me to pull out a weapon or finally submit and unlock my device to transfer his funds. Instead, I pulled out my phone and tapped the screen twice. I did not dial Marcus Vance. I pressed play on an audio file I had kept encrypted on a secure server for 3 years. The scratchy, digitized hiss of an old microcassette tape filled the locked dining room. The audio was slightly muffled, carrying the distinct ambient echo of an underground parking garage, but the voices were unmistakably clear. The first voice belonged to a much younger Richard Thorne. His tone was arrogant, impatient, and laced with absolute authority. $50,000 cash. Peterson, the recorded voice of my father, echoed off the walls. All in unmarked, non-sequential bills. It is all inside the duffel bag. There was a pause on the recording, followed by the sound of a heavy canvas bag hitting the hood of a car. Then a second voice spoke. It was gruff, hesitant, and clearly nervous. "I do not know, Mr. Thorne," the second man stammered. "The burn patterns on the baseboards outside her bedroom door are highly irregular. There are clear, undeniable traces of chemical accelerants. The fire marshal is going to want a full, rigorous investigation. This does not look like an accident." "Then you make it look like an accident, Peterson," the recorded voice of my father snapped back, utterly devoid of any human empathy. "You are the senior fire inspector for this district. You write the final incident report. You state for the official record that the blaze originated from a tragic electrical fault in the vintage wiring of the East Wing. A freak accident. End of story. Do we have an understanding, or do I need to take this duffel bag to your supervisor? A long, agonizing silence stretched on the tape. Finally, the inspector let out a defeated sigh. Electrical fault in the East Wing. I will file the paperwork in the morning. The recording clicked off, leaving a suffocating, paralyzing silence in its wake. Richard froze. The homicidal rage in his eyes fractured instantly, replaced by a blind, staggering panic. He stumbled backward, putting distance between us as if my phone were a live explosive. He looked wildly around the room, his chest heaving, his mind desperately scrambling to construct a defense against the undeniable proof of his crimes. "That is fabricated!" Richard shouted, his voice cracking into a high, hysterical bark. He pointed a shaking finger at the device in my hand. "That is a fake. You used artificial intelligence to generate that audio. It is a deepfake. You created a fraudulent recording to blackmail me. No court in the country will ever admit that digital garbage as evidence." I stepped forward, invading his space, forcing him to back up until his shoulders hit the heavy mahogany door he had just locked. I looked him dead in the eyes, relishing the absolute bottomless terror flooding his pupils. "The fire inspector does not think it is a deepfake," I said softly, delivering the final fatal blow. "He took a federal plea deal yesterday morning. He handed over the original microcassette tape to avoid a mandatory minimum sentence. He is sitting in federal custody right now, Richard, and he is singing like a bird." Richard stared at me, the color draining from his face, until his skin resembled wet ash. The realization that his ironclad alibi from 15 years ago was currently sitting in a federal interrogation room completely shattered him. His knees gave out. The man who had terrorized me for my entire existence slid down the heavy mahogany door he had just locked, his massive frame collapsing onto the floor like a puppet with its strings suddenly cut. He clutched his chest, struggling to pull oxygen into his lungs, defeated and utterly broken. But the parasite that was my mother refused to die quietly. Brenda watched her husband dissolve into a pathetic, whimpering mess and instantly calculated her own survival odds. Her eyes darted wildly around the room, taking in the shattered glass, Cameron bleeding on the carpet, and Richard paralyzed by the certainty of a federal prison sentence. She began to hyperventilate, her chest heaving as her manicured hands clawed at the ruined fabric of her designer dress. If the corporate empire was gone and her husband was facing decades behind bars, she needed a new lifeline. She needed the old money. She scrambled toward Cameron, her high heels crunching over the debris. She grabbed him by the shoulders, shaking him violently to force his attention away from his own ruined life. "It does not matter!" Brenda shrieked, her voice echoing with a frantic, unhinged desperation. "Let them have the corporate shell. Let the feds take your father. We do not need them or Aegis Financial. Listen to me, Cameron. Your grandfather left the entire family estate directly to you. The historic properties in Boston, the land trusts in the valley, the ancestral holdings. They are completely insulated from Richard's bankruptcy. We will sell the properties. We will liquidate every single square inch of the estate and start over. We can take the cash and move to Europe. We still have the grandfather's wealth." Cameron looked up at her, a dull, stupid flicker of hope igniting in his swollen eyes. He wiped the blood from his mouth, clinging to his mother's frantic promise like a drowning man clutching a piece of driftwood. They really believed they still had a parachute. They believed the bedrock of the Thorne legacy was still sitting safely in their vault, waiting to fund their luxurious escape. I watched this pathetic display of aristocratic delusion with a sense of profound, icy satisfaction. I slowly walked over to the leather briefcase I had left resting on one of the plush velvet chairs. I snapped the gold latches open. The sharp metallic sound made Brenda flinch and turn her head toward me. I reached inside and pulled out an old yellow document. The paper was thick-aged and bound with a dark green ribbon that bore the heavy, unmistakable wax seal of my grandfather. I held it up, letting the ambient light of the dining room catch the embossed lettering. "You mean this will, Brenda?" I asked, my voice cutting through her hysterical plotting with surgical precision. Brenda froze. Her eyes locked onto the document in my hand, and her jaw dropped slightly. Cameron dragged himself up onto his elbows, squinting at the yellowed paper. "That is impossible," Brenda stammered, taking a step backward. "That is a fake. We probated the official will 14 years ago. The entire estate was transferred to Cameron. It is public record." I shook my head slowly, allowing a cold, merciless smile to touch my lips. "You probated a piece of fiction," I corrected her. "This is the original, unadulterated will drafted and signed by Grandfather exactly 3 days before Richard decided to set my bedroom on fire." Grandfather was old, but he was never blind. He knew exactly what Cameron was. He knew your golden boy was an incompetent, arrogant idiot who would squander a century of family wealth on bad investments and flashy casinos. Grandfather saw my potential. He saw that I was the only one with the intellect and the discipline to actually grow the Thorne legacy. So he quietly updated his estate planning, bypassing all of you. He left 100% of his assets, every historic property, every land trust, and every penny of the old money entirely to me. Brenda shook her head violently, her eyes wide with mounting terror. "No, no, that cannot be true. We have the legal documents. The judge signed off on Cameron as the sole heir. You are lying." I stepped closer, holding the yellowed parchment up so she could see her father-in-law's sprawling, authentic signature at the bottom of the page. "I am not lying, Brenda, but you certainly did," I stated, my voice echoing with absolute, unwavering authority. "When the fire happened, you and Richard assumed I was dead. You thought the only obstacle between you and the ancestral wealth had been conveniently reduced to ash. But then you searched Grandfather's study and found a copy of this document. You realized he had cut your precious son out completely, so you did what you always do. You cheated." Cameron stared at his mother, his mouth hanging open. "Mom," he whispered, "what did you do?" Brenda could not speak. She was hyperventilating so hard she looked like she might pass out. I gladly filled in the blanks for him. "Your mother forged a newer version of the will right after the fire," I explained, keeping my eyes locked on Brenda's horrified face. "She typed up a fraudulent document naming you as the sole beneficiary, forged Grandfather's signature, and bribed a shady notary to backdate the stamp to make it look like his final dying wish. It was a sloppy, desperate move, but it worked because nobody was left to challenge it. Until now." Brenda pressed her back against the wall, her hands shaking violently. "You have no proof," she gasped out. "It has been over a decade. The statute of limitations. The courts accepted it. You cannot prove anything." I slid the yellowed will back into my briefcase and pulled out a thick, modern legal folder bound in red tape. I tossed it onto the floor right at Brenda's feet. It landed with a heavy, satisfying thud. "I do not need to rely on old memories," I said, my tone dripping with lethal confidence. "When I took control of Aegis Financial, I hired the premier forensic document examination team in the country. They are the same experts the federal government uses for high-level treason cases. I had them pull the original copy of your probated will from the county archives. They performed a microchemical analysis on the ink." Brenda let out a small, terrified squeak. "Do you want to know what they found?" I asked, stepping right into her personal space. "They found that the specific chemical composition of the ink used for Grandfather's supposed signature was not even manufactured until 2 years after he died. They analyzed the paper fibers and found they were sourced from a batch produced exclusively in Europe long after the date printed at the top of the page. And the notary stamp. The forensic team matched the microscopic imperfections in the rubber stamp directly to a fraudulent notary who was indicted for real estate scams 6 years ago." Cameron let his head fall back against the carpet, letting out a hollow, agonizing groan. He was entirely ruined, and now he knew his mother had built his entire financial foundation on a massive, easily provable lie. "You did not just commit a minor clerical error, Brenda," I said, my voice rising in power and intensity. "You committed federal inheritance fraud. You engaged in wire fraud, mail fraud, and criminal conspiracy to defraud a legal heir. The statute of limitations for grand larceny of this magnitude is paused when the victim is incapacitated or presumed dead. The clock only started ticking the moment I resurfaced. You stole my birthright and you built your lavish, pathetic suburban life on stolen funds. Brenda collapsed to her knees, her designer dress pooling around her on the floor. She looked up at me with tears streaming down her face, her hands clasped together as if she were praying to a ruthless, unforgiving God. "Please, Peyton," she begged, her voice a fragile, broken whine. "I am your mother. I gave birth to you." I was scared. Richard pressured me. I just wanted to protect my children. I looked down at her with absolute disgust. "You wanted to protect your lifestyle. And now you are going to lose everything. The FBI is going to seize every property Cameron currently holds because they were purchased with fraudulently acquired capital. You are going to be indicted for forgery and federal fraud." I crouched down so I was eye level with her, ensuring she heard every single word of her impending destruction. "I have already submitted the forensic reports to the district attorney," I whispered. "They have impounded the fraudulent will. The grand jury convenes on Monday." The grand jury threat hung in the air, thick and suffocating. Brenda remained crumpled on the carpet, her face buried in her hands, weeping with the loud, ugly gasps of a woman who had just watched her entire aristocratic universe implode. Richard was still slumped against the locked door, a hollowed-out shell of a man, paralyzed by the sudden, terrifying reality of federal prison. I had dismantled the Thorne family legacy brick by historic brick. But true to the pathological arrogance that defined his very existence, Cameron refused to accept his own demise. A sound broke through Brenda's sobbing. It started as a low, wet cough bubbling up from Cameron's throat as he lay bleeding on the shattered glass. The cough morphed into a chuckle. Then the chuckle escalated into a full, manic roar of laughter. It was a grating, hysterical sound, completely unhinged and dripping with desperate delusion. Cameron pushed himself off the floor, slipping once on the slick mahogany fragments of the ruined conference table before finally finding his footing. He swayed heavily, clutching his bruised ribs with one hand, while using the other to wipe a smear of blood from his chin. His custom-tailored suit was torn, his tie was gone, and his face was a swollen purple mess. Yet he looked at me with a sickening, triumphant sneer. "You think you have won?" Cameron laughed, his voice ragged and breathless. "You really think you have outsmarted me, Peyton? You think taking away my grandfather's dusty old real estate portfolio means I am finished? You think I care about those crumbling ancestral properties or my mother's stupid forged documents?" He spat another mouthful of blood onto the floor and stood up straighter, puffing out his chest in a pathetic display of dominance. "I do not need grandfather's estate," Cameron declared, his eyes burning with a feverish, delusional fire. "I do not need Aegis Financial. I do not even need my father's money anymore. I outgrew this family years ago. While my father was busy hiding cash in the Caymans, and my mother was busy playing arts and crafts with a notary stamp, I was actually building an empire of my own." I stood perfectly still, watching him construct his final spectacular delusion. I did not interrupt him. When an opponent is digging their own grave, the polite thing to do is hand them a bigger shovel. Cameron reached into his torn jacket pocket and pulled out his smartphone. He held it up like a weapon, pointing the cracked screen directly at me. "I have a silent investor," Cameron boasted, his voice echoing loudly in the locked VIP room. "A private venture capitalist out of Geneva, an absolute titan of industry who actually recognizes my genius. Someone who saw my vision for the commercial tech sector when my own father called me a failure. This investor backed my latest venture with $50 million in liquid capital. Yes, he owns 51% of my company. Yes, he has a controlling equity stake, but he is backing me, Peyton. He is my partner." Brenda looked up from the floor, her tear-streaked face contorted in absolute confusion. Richard did not even blink, his eyes still fixed vacantly on the opposite wall. "My investor is going to inject fresh capital by midnight," Cameron continued, his thumb hovering over his phone screen. "He is going to wipe out my corporate debt. He is going to provide the legal shielding I need to completely sever myself from my father's federal indictment. You can have the Thorne legacy, Peyton. I am leaving this room and I am building my own." With a dramatic, sweeping gesture, Cameron tapped the screen of his phone and activated the speaker. "I am calling him right now," Cameron sneered, holding the device up so the entire room could hear. "I am going to put him on speakerphone. I want you to listen to the sound of my rescue, Peyton. I want you to hear the voice of the man who is going to completely neutralize everything you just did to me." He pressed the dial button. The digital ringing tone echoed through the silent, ruined dining room. One long, steady ring. Cameron smiled a bloody, arrogant smirk that showcased every ounce of his staggering entitlement. He was waiting for his savior. He was waiting for his ultimate validation. A second ring echoed from the speaker. But then a completely different sound joined the electronic noise. It was a crisp, sharp, customized ringtone. It was bright, professional, and entirely out of place in the blood-stained wreckage of the VIP room. The sound was not coming from Cameron's speakerphone. The sound was coming directly from my pocket. Brenda's weeping stopped instantly. Richard finally blinked, turning his head slowly toward the noise. Cameron's arrogant smirk froze his eyes, darting from his own device down to my tailored blazer. The third ring from Cameron's speakerphone synchronized perfectly down to the exact millisecond with the ringing coming from my jacket. I maintained deliberate, excruciatingly slow eye contact with Cameron. I reached my hand into the inner pocket of my blazer and retrieved a sleek black secondary cell phone. The screen was glowing brightly in the dim light of the room. I held the device up. The caller ID flashing on my screen was unmistakable. It simply read, "Cameron Thorne, target asset." The color drained entirely from Cameron's face, leaving him looking like a reanimated corpse. His hand began to shake so violently that he nearly dropped his own phone. The speakerphone echoed with a fourth synchronized ring. "No!" Cameron whispered, the breath rushing out of his lungs in a sharp, horrified gasp. "No, that is not possible. You are not—" I slid my thumb across the green accept button on my screen. The ringing stopped abruptly on both devices, replaced by a hollow open line of static. I raised my secondary phone to my mouth. I did not look away from his terrified, shattered eyes for a single second. I spoke clearly, my voice carrying through the air and echoing simultaneously out of the speakerphone still clutched in his trembling hand. "Hello, Cameron." The sound of my own voice, amplified through his device, hit him like a physical blow. He staggered backward, his mouth opening and closing without producing a sound. "Yes," I continued, my tone dripping with absolute glacial victory. "I am your silent investor." Cameron shook his head frantically, backing away until his spine hit the velvet wall. "No, the Geneva firm, the shell company, the 50 million. I have been funding your catastrophic failures through a blind shell company for 3 entire years," I stated, walking slowly toward him, closing the distance until there was nowhere left for him to run. "I read every idiotic business proposal you ever drafted. I approved every terrible acquisition you ever pitched. I fed your massive, fragile ego exactly what it needed to hear, all while quietly securing my 51% controlling stake." I stopped directly in front of him, looking down at the broken man who had once tried to destroy my life. "I did not just buy equity, Cameron," I said, delivering the final devastating truth. "I bought your intellectual property. I bought your commercial debt. I bought your personal collateral. I financed your delusions just so I could legally own every single thing you touch." Cameron dropped his phone. It hit the floor, cracking the screen, further mirroring his shattered reality. The last lifeline he thought he had was just another noose I had tied around his neck. He curled inward, pressing his forehead against the carpet, weeping with the ragged, breathless gasps of a man who had finally hit the absolute bottom. I stepped over his phone and turned my attention back to the rest of the room. The silence was suffocating, heavy with the stench of total defeat. Brenda stared at Cameron, then looked at Richard, who was still slumped against the locked mahogany door. Her eyes darted back and forth between her ruined son and her ruined husband. The aristocratic mask, the decades of carefully cultivated high society elegance, melted right off her face. The survival instinct of a cornered rat took over. She realized there was no money left. No hidden accounts, no offshore lifelines, no ancestral estates. I owned it all, and the FBI was coming for the rest. Brenda pushed herself off the wall. She did not run to comfort her son. She did not offer a hand to her husband. Instead, she pointed a trembling, manicured finger directly at Richard. "It was him!" Brenda screamed, her voice shrill and echoing off the vaulted ceiling. He forced me to do it. I had nothing to do with this. I am a victim of his abuse. Richard's head snapped up. His bloodshot eyes locked onto his wife, a mix of shock and lethal fury, washing over his bruised face. "What are you doing, Brenda?" Richard growled, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "I am telling the truth!" she shrieked, backing away from him and turning toward me with wide, pleading eyes. "Peyton, you have to believe me. He controlled everything. He controlled the bank accounts, the properties, my entire life. I was terrified of him. During the fire 15 years ago, I wanted to wake you up. I swear to you, I tried to run to your bedroom. But he stopped me. Richard physically grabbed me in the hallway. He forced me down the stairs. He is the one who locked your bedroom door from the outside, Peyton. He locked you in to burn. I begged him to let you out, but he forced me out of the house. I am innocent." She was hyperventilating, tears of sheer panic streaming down her cheeks. She was throwing the man she had conspired with for over 3 decades directly into the flames, hoping his burning corpse would create a bridge for her to walk across. It was a spectacular, pathetic display of cowardice. Richard slowly pushed himself up from the floor. He leaned heavily against the doorframe, breathing hard blood dripping from his chin onto his torn collar. He looked at the woman he had built his fraudulent empire with, and a cold, monstrous laugh erupted from his chest. "You vindictive, lying parasite," Richard spat, taking a heavy step toward her. "You were never a victim. You were the architect. You spent every single dime I ever made to buy your way into the country club, and when the money ran out, you were the one who suggested we collect on the life insurance." "That is a lie," Brenda shrieked, covering her ears. "I never wanted anyone to get hurt." "Do not play the innocent mother now, Brenda," Richard roared, his voice shaking the crystal chandeliers above us. "You think I trusted you. You think I spent 30 years sleeping next to a viper without keeping an anti-venom in my pocket." Richard dug his hand into his ruined suit pants. He pulled out his own smartphone, his thumb swiping aggressively across the screen. He did not care about the FBI anymore. He did not care about the bankruptcy or the fraud. The only thing that mattered to him in this moment was making sure that if he was going down, his treacherous wife was chained to his ankle. "I kept the backups," Richard said, a feral grin twisting his bloody face. "I kept everything on a secure cloud server. Every text message, every email, every voicemail you ever left me when you were too drunk on Chardonnay to remember that digital records are forever." He tapped the screen and maximized the volume. The tinny, compressed audio of a 15-year-old voicemail filled the VIP room. The voice was undeniably Brenda's. It was not panicked, it was not fearful, and it was certainly not the voice of a victim. It was stone cold, calculating, and ruthless. "Richard, it is me," the recorded voice of my mother echoed through the silence. "I am looking at the final foreclosure notices. We are completely out of time. Do what we talked about tonight. And Richard, if Peyton does not make it out, the insurance payout covers our debts. The policy is ironclad. Just make sure Cameron is safe. I will have the car waiting down the block." The voicemail clicked off. The silence that followed was absolute. The definitive proof of her attempted murder, spoken in her own voice, hung in the air like toxic gas. Brenda let out a guttural, inhuman screech. She lunged at Richard, her perfectly manicured nails extended like claws. She hit him with the force of a desperate animal tearing at his face, trying to rip the phone from his hands. "Give it to me!" she screamed, her voice cracking as she clawed at his eyes. "Delete it! Delete it right now!" Richard did not back down. He grabbed her by the wrists, twisting her arms brutally, throwing her back against the wall. She bounced off the velvet paneling and charged him again, kicking and scratching. They tore into each other with absolute feral abandon. The polished elite facade of the Thorne family was entirely gone. They were just two cornered predators tearing each other to pieces in a cage of their own making. As they thrashed and screamed, trading vicious blows and exposing decades of rotten, disgusting secrets, Richard roared about her affairs with the board members. Brenda shrieked about the money he had embezzled from her own sister's estate. They were doing the prosecution's job for them, airing every dirty illegal deed they had committed in their toxic, miserable marriage. I stood perfectly still, watching them destroy themselves. I did not intervene. I did not move. I just watched the fire I had set finally consume them. And then, cutting through the sounds of shattering glass and their vicious, bloody screams, a new noise pierced the thick walls of the Waldorf Astoria. It started faintly in the distance, a high, rhythmic wail echoing off the downtown skyscrapers, but it was growing louder by the second, approaching fast, multiplying, heavy sirens. Red and blue lights began to flash against the heavy drapes of the VIP room windows. The authorities had arrived. The deafening wail of the heavy sirens sliced through the manic shrieks of my parents. The flashing red and blue lights reflected off the antique mirrors of the Waldorf Astoria VIP room, painting Richard and Brenda in the harsh, unforgiving colors of their impending arrest. The reality of the sound hit Richard like a physical blow. The feral wrestling match abruptly ceased. Richard froze, his hands still gripping Brenda's torn designer collar. He looked toward the heavy draped windows, then snapped his gaze directly to me. The raw, unfiltered terror in his eyes was magnificent to witness. He finally understood the magnitude of his absolute defeat. He realized that I had not just cornered him financially, I had actually called the federal authorities. The grand jury was not a distant threat for next week. The FBI was pulling up to the valet stand right now. Survival instinct, stripped of all corporate sophistication, violently took over. Richard shoved Brenda backward with a reckless force that sent her sprawling. She cried out as she hit the floor, her expensive dress tangling around her legs, her hands sliding helplessly across the spilled wine and shattered glass that coated the expensive carpet. Cameron, still bleeding and broken from his own financial execution, let out a pathetic whimper as the reality of the approaching police sirens finally penetrated his thick skull. Richard did not spare his wife or his son a single glance. They were dead weight, now heavy anchors that would strictly drag him to the bottom of a federal penitentiary. He scrambled to his feet, his breath hitching painfully in his chest. He lunged across the ruined room, snatching his heavy cashmere overcoat from the back of an overturned chair and grabbing his leather briefcase with a white-knuckled grip. His eyes darted wildly around the enclosed space, calculating the geometry of his escape. The main mahogany doors were securely locked, and I stood perfectly positioned between him and the hallway. But Richard knew the Waldorf Astoria intimately. He had conducted shady backdoor deals in this exact room for decades, leveraging every hidden architectural feature to his advantage. He knew about the private service elevator tucked behind the decorative wood paneling near the kitchen entrance. It was a discreet exit designed to let catering staff move unseen, a hidden artery leading directly down to the underground loading dock. It was his only way out. He sprinted toward it, his expensive leather shoes slipping frantically against the polished floorboards, his entire body propelled by the pure, unadulterated terror of incarceration. I did not move a single muscle. I stood completely still in the center of the wreckage, my hands resting casually in the pockets of my trousers, watching the great Richard Thorne reduce himself to a fleeing rat. I watched him hurl his massive frame against the wood paneling, his fingers desperately clawing at the hidden seam, until the secret door popped open, revealing the brushed steel of the service elevator. He slammed his fist against the call button, hitting it over and over again in a rapid, frantic rhythm. He was panting heavily, sweat pouring down his bruised face, his eyes wide and unblinking. He actually believed he was going to make it. He believed he could slip down to the loading dock, buy his way onto a private charter, and disappear into a non-extradition country before the feds breached the lobby. A mechanical whir hummed behind the thick steel doors. The soft, pleasant chime of the arriving elevator echoed in the quiet space, cutting through the ambient noise of the sirens. Richard let out a breathless, sobbing gasp of relief. He gripped the handle of his briefcase, his body tensing, ready to bolt inside the second the doors parted. The steel door slid smoothly open. Richard took half a step forward before slamming to a complete, paralyzing halt. The service elevator was not empty. It was not carrying a terrified waiter or a cart of dirty dishes. The entire car was packed shoulder to shoulder with my private security team. 6 massive, heavily armed professionals in tailored dark suits stood in perfect formation. Their faces were carved out of stone, earpieces curled discreetly around their necks. They did not blink. They did not flinch. They simply stood there, an impenetrable wall of human muscle and tactical precision completely blocking the only remaining exit. The lead security director, a towering man named Vance, took one slow, deliberate step forward out of the elevator car. His massive frame seemed to swallow the ambient light in the room. He crossed his thick arms over his broad chest, staring down at Richard with absolute chilling indifference. The silence from the security team was louder than the sirens outside. The message was explicitly clear. I had planned for every single contingency. I knew about the hidden service elevator. I knew Richard's cowardly escape instincts better than he knew them himself. I had systematically sealed every single crack in the foundation of his life. There was nowhere left to hide, nowhere left to run, and no one left to bribe. Richard stumbled backward, clumsily retreating from the unmoving wall of security guards. He hit the edge of an ornate serving credenza, knocking a heavy silver tray to the floor with a loud, jarring clatter that made Brenda scream again. His chest heaved with ragged, uncontrollable breaths, his tie hanging loosely around his neck like a noose. The flashing police lights from the street below grew blindingly bright, illuminating the sheer madness completely overtaking his mind. The sirens were deafening now, a chaotic symphony of authority, meaning the federal agents were already pouring into the Grand Hotel lobby. They were securing the exits. They were marching into the elevators. They were minutes, perhaps seconds away from breaching the VIP room. He was trapped in a cage of his own design. A cornered animal is the most dangerous creature on earth, and Richard Thorne was entirely out of options. His eyes darted frantically around the room, skipping over the ruined antique furniture, skipping over the pathetic form of his sobbing wife, skipping over his bleeding, ruined son, crying on the floor. His gaze swept the perimeter until it locked onto the wall directly to my left. Mounted against the expensive vintage floral wallpaper was a bright red emergency firebox. Behind the thick reinforced safety glass rested a heavy solid steel fire axe, its polished blade gleaming menacingly in the flashing police lights. A dark primal shift fundamentally altered Richard's face. The last remaining shreds of his corporate sanity evaporated instantly, replaced by a violent, absolute desperation that stripped away his humanity. He let out a raw, guttural roar that tore at his throat. He dropped his leather briefcase, abandoning his stolen wealth, and lunged across the room toward the emergency box. Without a single second of hesitation, he swung his elbow brutally into the casing. The safety glass shattered outward in an explosive, echoing shower of sharp, glittering fragments. Richard reached his bleeding arm directly into the broken casing, his hand tightly gripping the heavy red handle of the axe, ripping the lethal weapon violently from its metal mount. The heavy steel blades of the axe caught the flashing emergency lights, gleaming with a deadly crimson reflection. Vance and the security team immediately shifted their stances, their hands dropping to their holstered weapons, ready to neutralize the threat. But Richard did not step toward them. He did not charge at me. His survival instincts, honed by decades of corporate savagery and ruthless self-preservation, overrode any impulsive desire for violence. He knew he could not fight his way through 6 armed professionals. He needed a diversion. He needed absolute, blinding chaos. With a guttural roar, Richard pivoted sharply away from the elevator. He swung the heavy axe backward, driving the blunt end of the steel head directly into the hotel's central fire alarm pull station, mounted on the adjacent marble pillar. The plastic casing exploded into jagged shrapnel. Instantly, the deafening, ear-splitting shriek of the building's primary fire alarm ripped through the room, syncing with the wail of the police sirens echoing from the street below. He did not stop. Fueled by a terrifying surge of adrenaline, Richard raised the axe high above his head and brought the razor-sharp blade down with bone-jarring force into the ornate mahogany paneling that concealed the VIP room's main electrical junction box. The expensive wood splintered outward in a shower of debris. He swung again, burying the steel deep into the thick exposed wiring. A massive, violent eruption of blue and white sparks showered across the carpet. The heavy crystal chandeliers hanging above us flickered erratically, let out a loud electrical pop, and died completely. Plunged into sudden darkness, the room was immediately hijacked by the blinding, erratic flashes of the emergency strobe lights. The sharp, acrid smell of ozone and burning electrical wire rapidly filled the enclosed space. Through the strobing flashes of harsh white light, I watched him. 15 years ago, this exact combination of sensory nightmares, the screaming alarms, the choking smell of burning material, the sudden terrifying darkness, had completely paralyzed me. It was the exact environment of the night my bedroom door was locked from the outside. The night I pounded my bruised, tiny fists against the heavy wood while the heat blistered my lungs and my parents drove away. Richard had used fire, darkness, and panic to erase my existence then. Now, in his final pathetic moments of desperate realization, his primal instinct was to use the exact same weapons to orchestrate his escape. The irony was staggering. He was trying to use the ghost of my trauma to save his own life. But I was no longer the terrified, helpless child trapped in a burning room. I did not flinch at the exploding sparks. I did not shrink away from the deafening alarms. I simply stood in the center of the flashing lights, completely unfazed, and watched the architect of my suffering thrash against the walls of his cage. I raised my left arm, pulling back the cuff of my tailored blazer to reveal my smartwatch. Richard did not know that Aegis Financial's aggressive portfolio acquisitions over the past 2 years had been highly specific. We did not just own Cameron's shell companies. We held the controlling majority stake in the commercial real estate management firm that operated this specific Waldorf Astoria property. I had total, uncontested administrative access to the building's infrastructure. With 3 precise, unhurried taps on the glowing screen, I bypassed the local security desk and triggered a Level 1 corporate override. Deep within the walls of the hotel, a series of heavy magnetic locks slammed shut with a resounding metallic clank that vibrated through the floorboards. I sealed the service corridors. I locked down the fire escapes. I disabled the freight elevators. With a few movements of my finger, I turned the entire west wing of the hotel into a digital rat maze, leaving only one open path. I was actively funneling him exactly where I wanted him to go. Richard yanked the axe free from the sparking wires and tossed it onto the floor. Realizing the service elevator was still entirely blocked by my unmoving security team, he spun around. His chest heaved as he calculated his single remaining option. He sprinted toward the main double doors of the VIP room, stepping right over Brenda, who was sobbing hysterically on the floor. He kicked the shattered mahogany doors open and bolted out into the grand gala hall. I walked slowly after him, stepping into the hallway to watch the final act of his destruction. The grand ballroom was in a state of absolute, unmitigated pandemonium. The fire alarms were screaming and the emergency strobes cast erratic, terrifying shadows across the massive space. Hundreds of the city's most elite, wealthy donors were in full panic mode. Women in expensive ball gowns and men in custom tuxedos were screaming, pushing, and trampling over each other in a desperate bid to reach the exits. Tables were overturned, champagne glasses shattered underfoot, and the facade of high society completely dissolved into a stampede of terrified animals. Richard hit the crowd like a freight train. Stripped of his aristocratic elegance, his suit torn, and his face covered in blood and sweat, he used his massive frame to violently shove his way through the sea of panicked guests. He threw a prominent bank executive to the floor. He shouldered a terrified socialite out of his path. He was trampling the very people he had spent his entire pathetic life trying to impress, solely focused on the grand brass exit doors at the far end of the lobby. He could see the cold night air rushing in from the street. He could taste freedom. He lowered his shoulders, sprinting with every ounce of strength left in his aging body, preparing to burst through the threshold and disappear into the chaotic Manhattan night. He lunged through the grand exit doors. He did not hit the cold night air. Richard slammed face first into a solid, unyielding wall of black Kevlar and reinforced tactical shields. The impact snapped his head back with a sickening crunch. Dozens of heavy tactical flashlights instantly blinded him, piercing through the strobing emergency lights. The screaming of the wealthy donors was entirely drowned out by the booming, synchronized roar of the federal strike team. Heavily armed FBI agents swarmed him from every angle, grabbing his arms, sweeping his legs, and driving the great Richard Thorne brutally down onto the shattered glass of the lobby floor. The sickening thud of Richard Thorne hitting the floor resonated through the grand ballroom, momentarily cutting through the blaring alarms and the screams of the crowd. 3 heavily armored federal agents immediately dropped their weight onto his back, driving the air from his lungs in a violent, forceful rush. His cheek smashed into a puddle of spilled champagne and crushed crystal. He thrashed blindly, his massive hands desperately clawing at the slick marble tiles, but the tactical team moved with ruthless efficiency. One agent drove a heavy knee sharply between Richard's shoulder blades while another wrenched his arms behind his back with enough force to make his shoulder joints pop audibly. The chaotic stampede of the gala guests froze completely. The sheer shock of the violent federal raid acted like a bucket of ice water thrown over the high society crowd. The emergency strobes continued to flash, casting sharp, disjointed shadows across the horrified faces of Wall Street billionaires, corrupt politicians, and inherited wealth socialites. They watched in absolute breathless silence as the untouchable titan of Aegis Financial was pinned to the floor like a common street thug. A sharp, commanding voice barked over a bullhorn, ordering all guests to stand down and clear the center aisle. The remaining members of the string quartet, who had been huddled together beneath the stage, completely stopped playing. The silence that fell over the massive ballroom, save for the low hum of the dying fire alarm, was deafening. I stepped over the splintered remains of the mahogany doors and walked out of the VIP suite. The air in the ballroom was thick with ozone from the electrical fire and the sour stench of human panic, but I breathed it in like fresh mountain air. I smoothed the lapels of my tailored blazer, holding the thick red-taped master file securely under my right arm. The sea of black Kevlar and tactical gear seamlessly parted for me. Federal agents stepped aside, creating a clear, unobstructed path directly to where Richard lay gasping on the floor. I walked with the slow, measured pace of a woman who had spent 15 long years waiting for this exact sequence of events. Every eye in the ballroom locked onto me. The elite donors who had dismissed me as a dead child, the board members who had actively enabled Richard's empire, all of them stared in stunned, fearful silence. They were witnessing a ghost dismantle a king. A tall man in a dark trench coat with a federal badge clipped to his belt stepped forward from the perimeter of the strike team. He bypassed the struggling Richard entirely and walked directly toward me. "Ms. Thorne!" Lead Agent Miller said, his voice carrying clearly across the silent, sprawling ballroom. "You initiated the corporate override." "I did, Agent Miller," I replied, my voice steady and echoing with absolute authority. "The hotel grid is secure. All service exits are electronically locked." He had nowhere else to run. I extended my arm and handed the heavy legal binder over to the federal agent. He took it with both hands, feeling the literal weight of my revenge. The binder contained over 500 pages of meticulously gathered intelligence. Every bank statement, every hidden shell company, every corrupted land deed, and every single forged signature. It was the physical culmination of my entire existence. "Everything you requested is in there," I stated, ensuring my voice was loud enough for Richard to hear every single syllable over the ringing in his ears. "You will find the complete forensic audit of Aegis Financial tracking exactly $42 million in wire fraud routed through Cameron Thorne's offshore shell companies. You will find the original unprobated will signed by my grandfather alongside the microchemical ink analysis proving Brenda Thorne forged the document you currently have on public record." Richard let out a muffled, agonizing groan from the floor, his face still pressed aggressively into the broken glass. I looked down at him, allowing a razor-thin, victorious smile to touch my lips. "And most importantly, Agent Miller." I continued, keeping my eyes locked on the pathetic man bleeding on the marble. "You will find the newly unsealed arson report from the fire marshal, combined with a digital audio recording of Brenda Thorne explicitly plotting to collect the insurance payout on my life 15 years ago. The evidence of premeditated attempted murder is absolute. Agent Miller nodded sharply, his expression hardening as he looked down at the binder, then down at the man groveling on the floor. Thank you, Ms. Thorne. Your cooperation with the Securities and Exchange Commission and the Bureau has been flawless. We have it from here. Agent Miller gave a short, sharp nod to the tactical team pinning my father. The heavy metallic click of steel handcuffs snapping tightly around Richard Thorne's wrists rang out like a gunshot in the silent ballroom. It was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. The agents hauled him roughly to his feet. His custom tuxedo was shredded, soaked in alcohol and his own blood. He looked completely defeated, his chest heaving, his eyes wide and vacant as Agent Miller began reading him his Miranda rights in a cold, clinical tone. Richard did not struggle anymore. The fight had been entirely beaten out of him. Without waiting for the arrest procedure to conclude, a separate squad of federal agents marched past Richard in a tight, disciplined formation. They stepped over the threshold of the ruined VIP doors and disappeared into the room I had just vacated. Less than 30 seconds later, they emerged. Two agents dragged Brenda Thorne out into the harsh, flashing lighting of the ballroom. She was wailing hysterically, her expensive designer dress torn and covered in soot from the electrical fire. Her makeup was running down her face in thick black streaks, and her manicured hands were bound tightly in flex cuffs behind her back. She twisted wildly, begging the surrounding socialites to call her lawyer. Not a single person in the crowd moved to help her. They simply watched her fall from grace. Right behind her, two more agents practically carried Cameron. He did not fight. He did not speak. His custom shoes dragged limply across the marble floor. Blood seeped from his nose and his eyes were completely dead, staring blankly ahead at nothing at all. The golden boy of the Thorne Empire was completely catatonic, utterly and permanently broken by the realization that his entire life was a stolen, fraudulent lie. The federal agents did not treat Richard Thorne like a billionaire. They treated him like a violent, fleeing felon. They hauled his massive, bleeding frame off the shattered glass with zero regard for his comfort. His custom-tailored tuxedo jacket ripped at the shoulder seam as they wrenched his arms backward. The heavy steel handcuffs bit deep into his wrists, locking with a sharp metallic snap that echoed over the dying wail of the fire alarms. Richard was panting heavily, spitting blood onto the polished marble, his eyes darting wildly toward the exit doors he had failed to breach. The ballroom had descended into a surreal, paralyzed theater. The screams of panic from the elite donors had rapidly morphed into a collective, stunned silence, broken only by the crackle of federal radios and the heavy boots of the strike team. The city's most influential power brokers, politicians, and socialites stood frozen among overturned tables and spilled champagne. Then the inevitable happened. A single smartphone was raised from the crowd. A bright flash illuminated Richard's battered face. Then another. Within seconds, a blinding sea of digital flashes erupted across the massive room. The press members who had been invited to cover a philanthropic charity gala were now feverishly live-streaming the criminal execution of the Thorne Empire. Agent Miller barked a sharp command, and the rest of the Thorne family was hauled out of the VIP suite to join the procession. Brenda was completely unrecognizable. The carefully cultivated aristocratic elegance she had weaponized for decades was gone. Her expensive mascara had mixed with her tears, and the soot from the electrical fire creating dark, ugly streaks across her heavily contoured cheeks. Her diamond necklace sat crooked against her collarbone. She shrieked incoherently, twisting in the grip of two female agents, demanding her lawyers, demanding the hotel manager, demanding anyone who would listen to her frantic claims of innocence. Cameron was dragged closely behind her. He was a completely hollow shell. He did not fight the agents holding him up. His custom shoes dragged limply across the marble floor. Blood seeped from his nose and his eyes were entirely dead, staring blankly ahead at nothing. The agents formed a tight, heavily armed wedge, forcing the three prisoners to walk straight down the center aisle of the ballroom. It was the ultimate, inescapable social death. They were paraded directly past the people they had spent their entire lives trying to impress and manipulate. Richard locked eyes with a prominent state senator he had heavily bribed just last month. The senator immediately turned his back aggressively, pretending not to know him. Brenda screamed the name of a wealthy country club socialite she played tennis with every Tuesday. The woman simply raised her smartphone and recorded Brenda's hysterical breakdown without a single ounce of pity. They were entirely radioactive. They were being erased from high society in real time. As the procession neared the grand ice sculpture near the main exit, a figure stepped out from behind a marble pillar. Jada. She looked absolutely pristine. Her emerald green silk gown was completely untouched by the chaos, the smoke, or the panic. She stood perfectly straight, holding a crystal flute of champagne. Beside her stood a sharp-looking man in a gray suit clutching a thick leather briefcase. He was undeniably a high-powered federal defense attorney. Cameron's dead, vacant eyes suddenly focused. He saw his fiancée standing near the exit. A desperate, pathetic gasp escaped his lips. He actually tried to pull away from the federal agents, his body lunging weakly toward her. He believed she was waiting there to help him, to use her family's vast wealth and influence to post his bail and save him from the nightmare. Jada did not flinch. She did not reach out her hand. Her gaze was absolute, unforgiving ice. She looked at the broken, bleeding man she had planned to marry and offered nothing but a slow, mocking, victorious smile. She raised her champagne flute slightly in a silent, sarcastic toast. The reality of the situation hit Cameron with the force of a speeding train. The defense attorney, the calm demeanor, the complete lack of surprise. She had cut a deal. Jada had secured her own federal immunity by trading the entire Thorne family to the authorities. She had taken the evidence I fed her, marched straight to the SEC, and sold out her fiancé to guarantee her own freedom. She was tossing him to the wolves and walking away without a single scratch. Cameron let out a strangled, breathless sob. His knees completely buckled beneath him. The last remaining shred of his sanity snapped, forcing the federal agents to practically drag his dead weight across the floor. Jada simply turned her back and walked out the side door with her lawyer, leaving him to rot. I stood perfectly still in the center of the aisle, the heavy master file tucked securely under my arm. The sea of flashing cameras and whispering socialites parted around me. I was the architect of this beautiful, chaotic symphony, and I wanted a front row seat for the finale. The federal agents marched Richard past me first. He glared at me, his eyes burning with a venomous, impotent rage, but he kept his mouth firmly shut. He knew any threat he made now would simply be added to the federal indictment. Then came Brenda. She was thrashing wildly against the agents, her breath coming in ragged, hyperventilating shrieks. As they pulled her down the aisle, her manic, tear-filled eyes locked onto mine. She saw me standing there, calm, victorious, and completely untouched by the fire she had tried to drown me in 15 years ago. The psychological break was instantaneous and absolute, her aristocratic pride completely shattered. Brenda violently twisted her shoulders, throwing her entire body weight downward to break free from the agent's grip. She threw herself onto the floor. Her bare knees slammed hard into the shattered glass and spilled champagne coating the marble tiles. The agents yelled for her to stand up, reaching down to grab her arms, but she fought them off with the desperate, frantic energy of a dying animal. She crawled across the wet floor, her ruined designer gown soaking up the alcohol and blood. She dragged herself directly to my feet. "Peyton!" Brenda screamed, her voice cracking and echoing over the entire ballroom. "Peyton, please!" The hundreds of smartphone cameras surrounding us immediately angled downward, capturing every single second of her utter humiliation. "Please, I am begging you," Brenda sobbed, throwing her handcuffed arms forward as if trying to grasp my shoes. "I am your mother. You cannot do this to me. I will give you anything you want. Just tell them to let me go. Please, Peyton, please have mercy on me." She pressed her forehead against the cold, wet marble right at my feet, weeping hysterically in front of the entire city. I stared down at the trembling, pathetic woman groveling on the floor. This was the woman who had brought me into the world, the woman who was supposed to be my ultimate protector. Instead, she had meticulously planned my execution to fund her country club lifestyle. The cameras continued to flash blindly, immortalizing her total disgrace. I did not bend down to comfort her. I did not offer her a single shred of the empathy she was begging for. I stood tall, my posture perfectly rigid, letting the cold silence stretch out until her frantic sobs filled the massive ballroom. I looked directly into the lenses of the smartphones recording us. I wanted this broadcasted everywhere. I wanted every high society parasite, every ruthless corporate shark, and every corrupt politician in that room to hear exactly what happens when you cross me. I looked back down at Brenda. Her tear-streaked, mascara-stained face gazed up at me with a desperate, sickening hope. She actually thought the word mother still held any currency. "You are not my mother," I said, my voice echoing clearly in the cavernous space slicing straight through her hysterical cries. The absolute coldness of my tone made her flinch, as if I had struck her physically. Mothers do not lock their children in burning rooms. Mothers do not trade their daughters' flesh and blood for an insurance payout to cover their credit card debt. Brenda opened her mouth to argue, to spin one final pathetic lie, but the devastating truth had already been documented, recorded, and handed over to the federal agents standing right behind her. She had absolutely nothing left to barter with. The charade was over. "You threw me into the fire for $2 million, I stated, articulating every single syllable so there would be no misunderstanding. I leaned in slightly, ensuring my voice carried across the dead-silent ballroom. "Tonight, I spent $20 million just to watch you burn. I am not your daughter. I am the karma you thought you outran." Brenda let out a gut-wrenching wail, completely collapsing against the floor. She thrashed against the federal agents as they grabbed her by the arms and hauled her roughly to her feet. They dragged her backward, her designer heels scraping uselessly against the polished marble. I did not watch her go. I turned my back on the woman who gave birth to me, severing the final decaying thread that tied me to the Thorne family. I walked deliberately toward the front of the grand ballroom. The crowd of elites parted instantly, clearing a wide path for me as if I were royalty. They looked at me with a mixture of profound awe and deep, unsettling terror. They realized the level of calculated financial violence I was capable of executing. I stepped onto the main stage, moving past the shattered remnants of the charity gala's extravagant floral arrangements. I stepped up to the crystal podium. The microphone was still live, emitting a soft electronic hum. I tapped the microphone once. The sharp sound cracked through the room, commanding absolute, unwavering attention. Every single face in the crowd turned upward. "Ladies and gentlemen," I began, my voice projecting with crisp, undeniable authority over the hotel's high-fidelity sound system. "Tonight, you were invited here under the guise of philanthropy. You were manipulated into writing massive checks by a family of unrepentant criminals. Richard and Brenda Thorne used my supposed death as a prop. They paraded a fake tragedy to line their own pockets, using the Peyton Thorne Memorial Fund as a personal offshore slush fund to avoid federal bankruptcy." A collective gasp rippled through the audience. Wealthy donors exchanged horrified glances, realizing they had been actively scammed by the very people they considered peers. The quiet murmurs of outrage began to spread through the sea of expensive suits and ball gowns. However, I continued, raising a hand to instantly quiet the murmurs. I did not come here tonight simply to destroy the Thorne Empire. I came here to correct a 15-year injustice. As the newly established controlling shareholder of Aegis Financial and the absolute legal owner of all Thorne family assets, I have officially seized the entirety of the Memorial Fund. I looked out over the crowd, letting the heavy reality of my corporate takeover settle into their minds. I owned the building they were standing in. I owned the accounts their checks were drafted to. "Every single dollar you donated tonight will not be going to Richard Thorne's legal defense," I announced, my voice ringing with absolute finality. "Instead, Aegis Financial will be matching tonight's total donations at a ratio of 5-1. The combined capital will be immediately distributed to verified, heavily vetted organizations that actually need it. Specifically, the funds will go directly to real burn victim recovery centers and specialized shelters for homeless and abandoned youth across this city." I paused, letting the magnitude of the financial pivot sink in. I had taken their corrupt vanity project and forcefully transformed it into a weapon for genuine good. "The Thorne family is finished," I stated, staring down at the crowd with unwavering intensity. "But the money they stole will finally serve a purpose." For a split second, the grand ballroom was entirely silent. Then from the back of the room, a single person started clapping. It was soon joined by another, and then another. Within seconds, the entire crowd erupted. The applause swelled into a deafening, thunderous roar. The wealthy donors, the press, the socialites, they all cheered entirely, shifting their allegiance from the fallen king to the conqueror standing on the stage. It was a brutal, beautiful display of high society survival. They clapped for the charity, they clapped for the spectacle, and most importantly, they clapped because they were utterly terrified of being on my bad side. Through the massive glass windows of the Waldorf Astoria lobby, the flashing red and blue lights of the police cruisers painted the dark Manhattan street. I watched as the heavy glass doors were pushed open by the federal strike team. Richard Thorne, permanently stripped of his power and dignity, was forcefully shoved into the back of a waiting police vehicle. Brenda was dragged out right behind him, still sobbing hysterically, as an officer pushed her head down to clear the doorframe. Finally, Cameron was guided out, his hands cuffed tightly behind his back, staring blankly at the wet pavement as he was loaded into a separate transport unit. The heavy steel doors of the cruisers slammed shut. The sirens wailed to life, echoing through the concrete canyons of the city as the convoy pulled away, carrying the Thorne family directly into their absolute, undeniable ruin. I stood on the stage, the applause washing over me completely, and finally free. The wail of the police sirens slowly faded, blending seamlessly into the ambient noise of the Manhattan night. Through the shattered remains of the grand mahogany doors, I watched the rhythmic flashing of red and blue lights disappear down Park Avenue. They were gone. The Thorne Empire was permanently dismantled. The monster who had eagerly orchestrated my murder, the father who had greedily funded it, and the golden boy brother who had blindly benefited from my supposed ashes, were all sitting in the back of federal transport vehicles. They were completely stripped of their wealth, their influence, and their freedom. Inside the Waldorf Astoria, the stunned paralysis finally broke. The elite crowd began to disperse, but they did not rush toward the exits in a chaotic panic. Instead, they moved slowly, carefully, casting cautious, reverent glances in my direction. I stood near the crystal podium, smoothing the lapels of my tailored blazer, watching the wealthiest and most ruthless people in the city shuffle out of the room like scolded children. I could hear their hushed whispers echoing off the grand marble pillars. They were not talking about the massive Securities and Exchange Commission raid. They were not talking about the $42 million in wire fraud. They were talking about me. The dead heiress who crawled out of the ashes legally purchased her treacherous family's corporate debt and orchestrated a hostile, lethal takeover right in the middle of a high society black tie gala. The legend of Peyton Thorne was being cemented into the absolute bedrock of New York high society in real time. By tomorrow morning, the financial world would wake up to a massive tectonic shift. I would not just be seen as a survivor of a tragic fire. I would be recognized as a ruthless titan. I stepped down from the main stage and walked away from the ruined gala. A few heavily armed federal agents gave me sharp, respectful nods as I passed their established perimeter, but I did not stop to celebrate with them. I needed absolute quiet. I walked past the overturned banquet tables, the crushed crystal, and the spilled champagne, stepping into the private VIP elevator at the far end of the hall. I hit the button for the penthouse rooftop level and leaned my head back against the polished mirrored wall. As the elevator hummed quietly and began its rapid ascent, a profound, undeniable physical sensation washed over my entire body. For 15 grueling years, I had carried an invisible, crushing weight right on my chest. It was the toxic, suffocating burden of survival. Every single day since the fire had been a calculated chess move. Every dollar I saved, every digital alias I created, every offshore corporate shell company I established had been driven by the singular burning need for ultimate vengeance. Now, as the digital floor numbers ticked upward, that massive weight simply vanished. My lungs expanded fully and deeply for the first time in over a decade. I breathed in the conditioned air, feeling a surreal, absolute lightness taking over my limbs. The toxic burden of my past was completely gone. The elevator doors slid open with a soft chime. I walked down the plushly carpeted corridor and pushed open the heavy glass doors leading out to the rooftop terrace. The cold, crisp night air hit my face immediately, carrying the distant electric energy of the city. The Manhattan skyline stretched out before me, a breathtaking, infinite ocean of glittering skyscrapers, blinking lights, and endless possibilities. I walked purposefully over to a sleek teakwood bar cart set up near the edge of the stone terrace. Resting on a polished silver tray was a heavy, ornate crystal decanter filled with aged bourbon. I grasped the solid glass stopper, enjoying the heavy weight of it in my hand, and poured a generous measure into a thick tumbler. The dark amber liquid glowed richly under the soft ambient terrace lighting. I walked to the edge of the balcony, resting my forearms against the cool stone railing, and looked down at the sprawling streets below. I took a slow, deliberate sip of the bourbon. The liquid burned pleasantly down my throat, providing a sharp, grounding contrast to the cold winter wind whipping through my hair. I looked at the towering corporate skyscrapers surrounding me. Richard Thorne used to stand in penthouses, just like this one, looking down at the traffic, and boast that he owned this entire city. He genuinely believed his vast wealth made him an untouchable god. He believed that sacrificing his own daughter for an insurance payout was just a necessary strategic business transaction to maintain his elite status. He was an absolute fool. As I looked out over the glowing grid of Manhattan, I realized a fundamental, brutal truth about survival. People always assume that survival is simply about escaping the flames. They think the ultimate victory is in running away and hiding your terrible scars and living quietly and safely in the shadows, while the people who hurt you continue to thrive in the light. But simply escaping the fire is only the first step. True, lasting survival requires something much darker and much more demanding. It requires you to stop running from the heat entirely. It requires you to turn around, walk back into the inferno, and learn exactly how to own the fire. I did not just survive my family's horrific betrayal. I did not just wait around for fate or karma to intervene on my behalf. I orchestrated their total, undeniable destruction through absolute patience, sharp intelligence, and ruthless financial strategy. I spent years meticulously educating myself, mastering the highly complex financial systems they used to hide their dirty money and fund their lavish lives. I used my intelligence to track their hidden offshore accounts, mapping every single instance of wire fraud, embezzlement, and tax evasion. I employed an aggressive financial strategy to silently buy up their massive debt, positioning myself as the apex predator in their corporate ecosystem without them ever noticing my shadow approaching. I did not need to use physical violence to break them. Violence is cheap, messy, and temporary. Instead, I used the very thing they worshipped above all else to utterly destroy them. I weaponized their insatiable greed. I heavily exploited their blinding arrogance. I waited until they were at the absolute peak of their public triumph, surrounded by their elite peers and flashing cameras, to violently pull the rug out from under their entire existence. I took their stolen money, I took their freedom, and I permanently erased their legacy. I raised my crystal glass toward the glittering skyline, offering a silent, solemn toast to the ghost of the frightened, betrayed girl who had burned in that house 15 years ago. She was entirely gone, completely replaced by the powerful woman standing on the rooftop tonight. I took one final sip of the bourbon, letting a genuine, victorious smile spread across my face as I stared out at my city. The ultimate lesson from Peyton's story is that true survival transcends simply escaping the flames of betrayal. It requires actively reclaiming your power to rewrite the narrative. For years, she carried the heavy, suffocating burden of her family's cruelty. Rather than allowing that trauma to diminish her, she meticulously channeled her profound pain into patience, strategy, and self-education. By mastering the exact financial systems her abusers wielded against her, she transformed her victimhood into unassailable strength and delivered her own absolute justice. Share how you have turned a painful setback into your greatest personal comeback in the comments below.